The late autumn wind carried dust and whispers through the narrow streets of Copper Ridge, a mining town nestled in the harsh embrace of the Arizona Territory. The year was 1883, and civilization, or what passed for it in these parts, had begun to tame the wildlands. But some things remained unchanged: the rust-colored earth that stretched toward distant mountains, and the auctions. The wooden platform stood in the center of the market square, crude planks hammered together for displaying livestock. But today, as on too many days before, it held different merchandise. Inside the makeshift holding pen beside the platform, a woman knelt on the dirt floor. Her hands were bound with coarse rope that had rubbed her wrists raw, but she did not struggle against them. Instead, she closed her eyes and whispered words in Apache, so soft that even the guard dozing nearby couldn't hear them. Ancient words, prayers to ancestors who watched from beyond the veil. Sana no Ta, she with the eyes of the eagle, was the last of her band of Chiricahua. At 24, she had survived what no one should: the massacre of her people, the burning of her home, the months of captivity that followed. Her deerskin dress was torn and dirty, her black hair tangled from nights spent on cold ground. Yet her eyes remained unbroken, dark pools that reflected nothing back to those who looked into them. When she opened those eyes, she saw what others could not: a slender figure standing beyond the bars. A boy of perhaps 11 years with the same high cheekbones as her own, wearing the ceremonial paint of their people. Her brother Tarak, dead these 5 years past, his spirit refusing to journey to the afterlife. He pointed westward, his mouth moving in silent words she couldn't quite understand. "Time to show the merchandise," barked the guard, hauling himself to his feet. He grabbed a water bucket and threw its contents over Sana, soaking her clothing. "Gotta clean you up a bit for the customers." The guard unlocked the pen, yanked her to her feet by the ropes at her wrists, and pushed her toward the steps leading to the auction platform. Water dripped from her hair, down her face like tears she refused to shed. On the platform, the auctioneer, a man with greasy hair and a stained vest, grabbed her chin, turning her face roughly from side to side for the small crowd to inspect. "Next item up for bid, gents. Last Apache woman from the Chiricahua band, wiped out by our brave cavalry boys 5 years back," he announced with grotesque pride. "Strong back, healthy teeth, could be trained for housework or whatever else suits your fancy." This last part brought chuckles from several men in the crowd. Sana kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. In her mind, she was there, among the sacred peaks, not here where men's eyes crawled over her like insects. Mason Blackwell had no intention of attending an auction that day. He'd ridden into Copper Ridge for supplies for the coming winter. His small ranch 20 miles west of town needed fencing repairs, and his food stores were running low. At 32, Mason had grown accustomed to preparing for the long solitary months ahead. The left shoulder of his worn leather coat hung slightly lower than the right, a telltale sign of the old wound beneath. It ached more in the cold months, a constant reminder of what he'd done and failed to do. Some nights, when the pain kept him awake, he welcomed it as deserved punishment. As he reached for the door of the general store, laughter erupted from the market square a block away. Harsh, cruel laughter that made him pause. Mason told himself to ignore it. Whatever was happening, there was none of his business. He had learned the hard way that involvement only led to trouble. But then something peculiar happened. A cold breeze swept past him, carrying the scent of wood smoke and sage, out of place in this dusty street. It whispered past his ear with sounds that almost formed words, and Mason found himself turning toward the market square instead of entering the store. When he saw her, something twisted inside his chest, a recognition he couldn't place. She stood barefoot on rough boards, her wet clothing clinging to her thin frame. Her face was turned away, toward the mountains, but he knew instinctively she was Apache. The proud set of her shoulders, despite her bonds, told him as much. "Who'll start the bidding at $5? The auctioneer called out, yanking on the woman's rope to make her step forward. "She's the last one from that bunch that raided the Sullivan farm years back. Government says we can sell her as restitution." Mason knew it was a lie. The Chiricahua hadn't raided the Sullivan farm. He had been there, had seen what really happened. But such truth had no place here. $2, called out a red-faced man swaying slightly on his feet, whiskey bottle clutched in his grimy hand. "Hell, that's more than she's worth. But I could use something to warm my bed this winter. More laughter rippled through the crowd. The drunk elaborated on his intentions with crude gestures that made Mason's jaw tighten. $2 from Mr. Harlan? Any advance on two? The auctioneer called. $3, another voice called. Mason started to turn away. This wasn't his business. But as he began to leave, the wind shifted again, stronger this time, kicking up dust and carrying that same strange scent. For just a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement beside the woman, the outline of a boy with painted face, staring directly at him. When Mason blinked, the image was gone. $5 going once to Mr. Jenkins. The auctioneer's voice cut through Mason's thoughts. The bidding had continued while he stood frozen in place. The woman had finally turned her head, and for a fleeting second her eyes met his across the distance. Recognition flashed between them, impossible but undeniable. $5 going twice. $8, Mason heard himself say, the words coming unbidden to his lips. The crowd parted, heads turning to stare at the tall stranger who'd suddenly spoken. The auctioneer peered at him with narrowed eyes. $8 from the gentleman in the back. Any advance on 8? The previous bidders muttered among themselves but offered no higher price. No one in Copper Ridge would pay that much for an Apache woman. Sold to the gentleman for $8. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack that made the woman flinch almost imperceptibly. Mason pushed through the crowd, ignoring the curious stares and muttered comments. What was he doing? He had no need for a servant, no space in his solitary life for another person. Yet he found himself climbing the steps to the platform, pulling coins from his pocket and handing them to the auctioneer. Papers are yours, the man said, handing him a folded document. She's government property, legally transferred to you now. No refunds if she runs off or dies. Mason took the rope from the auctioneer's hand, noticing how the woman tensed at the exchange. He didn't pull on it, but merely held it loose in his fingers. Is there somewhere I can get her some water before we leave town? He asked, his voice rough from disuse. The auctioneer shrugged. Horse troughs over yonder, free of charge. This prompted more laughter from the lingering onlookers. Mason nodded once and gestured for the woman to follow him down the steps. She moved with cautious grace, staying just far enough behind him to avoid being pulled by the rope, but close enough that it remained slack. The calculation in this simple act told Mason volumes about what her captivity had been like. He led her away from the crowd to a water trough near the hitching posts. Mason took a tin cup hanging on a post nearby and dipped it into the water, then offered it to her. She stared at the cup, then at his face, her expression unreadable. Mason realized she was waiting for permission. Go ahead, he said quietly. She took the cup with bound hands and drank slowly, carefully, though he could see her throat working with thirst. When she'd finished, he refilled it twice more before she shook her head to decline another. Only then did Mason notice something that made his breath catch. As she lowered the cup, the sleeve of her dress pulled back slightly, revealing a scar on her wrist. It wasn't just any scar. It formed a distinct pattern, one he recognized instantly. The same pattern was burned into his left shoulder, hidden beneath his clothing, the mark of his former unit. Mason's mind raced with implications as he stepped closer to take the cup from her hands. As he did, the woman looked up, her dark eyes meeting his directly for the first time. De andi shonshui du shinasha, she said in Apache, her voice low but clear. Mason didn't understand her words, but a chill ran down his spine nonetheless. She continued to stare at him, then slowly shifted her gaze over his shoulder, her expression softening into something almost like recognition. Mason turned to look behind him, but saw nothing except empty space in the dusty street beyond. When he looked back, her face had resumed its careful blankness. Let's get those ropes off you, he said, pulling a small knife from his belt. The woman tensed visibly at the sight of the blade, but held still as he cut through the bindings. Once freed, she rubbed her raw wrists but made no move to run. Where would she go in a town full of people who saw her as less than human? Mason retrieved a wool blanket from his saddlebag and offered it to her. For the cold, he explained with a gesture when she hesitated. Finally, she took it, wrapping it around her shoulders with quiet dignity. His gelding, a sturdy buckskin named Chance, snorted and shifted as they approached. Mason spoke softly to the animal while untying its reins. "We'll ride double," he told the woman, though he wasn't sure how much English she understood. He motioned to indicate his meaning, then helped her mount, noting how light she was as he boosted her onto the saddle. Mason swung up behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the close quarters. As they rode out of town, Mason felt the woman grow tense when they passed the holding pen where she'd been kept. Her head turned slightly, as though looking at something specific, but when Mason followed her gaze, he saw nothing unusual. The road stretched before them, a pale ribbon cutting through red earth. 20 miles to his ranch, a small cabin, a barn, a corral, and acres of scrubland that supported his few cattle. Not much of a home, but it was his, and now, inexplicably, he was bringing someone else into it. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Mason found himself studying the woman's profile. High cheekbones, a straight nose, lips pressed firmly together. Her hair had dried in the afternoon heat, falling in a dark curtain down her back. She stared resolutely ahead, giving no indication of fatigue despite what must have been an exhausting day. "My place is about an hour more," Mason said, breaking the silence between them. "Not much, but it's quiet." The woman gave no sign that she understood or even heard him. But as he spoke, Mason noticed something on the back of her neck, partially hidden by her hair. A small tattoo or brand, just visible above the collar of her dress. He couldn't make out the details while riding, but something about it seemed familiar, tugging at memories he tried to bury. They crested a small rise, and Mason's ranch came into view below, a weathered cabin nestled against a stand of cottonwoods that marked a seasonal creek. A split-rail corral stood empty beside a barn that leaned slightly to one side. Smoke rose from the stone chimney. His neighbor, old Jim Harris, sometimes checked on the place when Mason was in town, starting a fire to warm the cabin before his return. The woman's posture changed subtly at the sight of the ranch, a slight stiffening of her spine, perhaps in apprehension of what awaited her there. "It's safe," Mason said, though he knew words meant little coming from a white man. Actions would have to prove his intentions. As they approached the cabin, the door opened, and Jim Harris stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. The old man squinted against the setting sun, then lowered his weapon when he recognized Mason. "Didn't expect you back so soon," he called, before his eyes settled on the woman. His bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Well now, what's this?" Mason dismounted, then offered a hand to help the woman down. She ignored it, sliding gracefully from the horse's back without assistance. "Jim, this is—" Mason realized he didn't know her name. She was at the auction in town. Understanding dawned on Jim's weathered face. Ah, one of them Apache women they've been selling off. He studied her with curious eyes that held none of the malice Mason had seen in town. "Don't rightly approve of that business myself, but ain't my place to judge what a man does with his money." "Cabin's warm. Got some stew on the fire," Jim continued. "Guess I'll be heading back to my place now." He gave Mason a pointed look that suggested they'd talk more later, then collected his hat and headed for his horse. "Thanks for checking in," Mason called after him. Jim waved without turning around, mounted his horse, and rode off toward his own homestead 5 miles east. Mason led the way to the cabin, holding the door open for the woman to enter. She hesitated on the threshold, her dark eyes scanning the interior as though looking for traps or threats. Finally, she stepped inside, keeping the blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The cabin was simple but neat. One main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, shelves holding a few books and supplies, and a narrow bed in the corner. A black iron stove stood against one wall, and a door led to a small lean-to that served as a storeroom. Mason closed the door against the evening chill and moved to stir the fire. The woman remained standing near the entrance, watching his every movement. "You can sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs at the table. When she didn't move, he added, "Please." After a moment's consideration, she perched on the edge of the chair, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Mason ladled stew from the pot hanging over the fire into 2 wooden bowls, placing one before her along with a spoon. "Eat," he encouraged, taking his own bowl to the opposite chair. The woman looked at the food, then at Mason. He realized she was waiting for him to eat first, perhaps fearing the food was somehow unsafe. Mason took a deliberate spoonful of the stew, then nodded to her. Only then did she begin to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as hunger overcame caution. As she ate, Mason noticed again the mark on her neck when she turned her head slightly. From this angle, he could see it clearly, a small, perfect rendering of a crossed arrow and star, the insignia of the 7th Cavalry Scout Division. His unit, the unit that had been responsible for the Chiricahua massacre 5 years ago. His appetite suddenly gone, Mason set down his spoon. This wasn't coincidence. This woman had been marked by his former comrades, perhaps as a prisoner, perhaps as something worse. And somehow, out of all the men in Copper Ridge that day, she had ended up with him. When she finished eating, Mason cleared the bowls, then stood awkwardly in the center of his own home, uncertain what to do next. "You can have the bed," he said finally, pointing to it. "I'll sleep outside." The woman's eyes widened slightly, the first real change in her expression since he'd bought her freedom. She glanced at the bed, then back at him, clearly trying to discern his true intentions. Mason gathered a bedroll from a trunk at the foot of the bed. "I'll be outside if you need anything," he said, heading for the door. "The bar slides across like this," he demonstrated, "if you want to lock it." He stepped out into the gathering darkness, closing the door behind him. After a moment, he heard the wooden bar slide into place. Good. She was cautious, smart. She would need to be. Mason made his camp beside the cabin, spreading his bedroll beneath the stars that were beginning to appear overhead. The night was growing cold, but he had slept in worse conditions. As he lay back, staring up at the vast expanse above, questions circled in his mind like hungry wolves. Who was she? How had she survived the massacre? What did she know about what happened that day? And why did he feel this strange connection to her, as though they had met before? Sleep was long in coming, and when it finally claimed him, Mason's dreams were filled with fire, screams, and a boy with painted face pointing accusingly at him across a field of bodies. Inside the cabin, Sana stood motionless for a long time after barring the door, listening to the white man's movements outside. When silence finally fell, she moved cautiously around the space, examining everything by the dying firelight. The cabin was simple but surprisingly clean. No empty bottles, no gambling paraphernalia, none of the things she had learned to associate with the soldiers who had held her captive. Books stood neatly on shelves, unusual for a rancher out here. She ran her fingers over their spines, recognizing the shapes of letters, though she could not read them. On a small table beside the bed sat a worn photograph in a wooden frame. Sana picked it up, studying the image of a younger version of the man who had bought her, standing beside another man in uniform. Brothers, perhaps, given the similarity in their features. She replaced it carefully, exactly as it had been. Above the fireplace hung a cavalry sword and an old rifle. Weapons, but displayed rather than ready for use. The man, Mason, the older one had called him, carried a pistol at his hip, but he had not threatened her with it. Not yet. Sana unwrapped the blanket from her shoulders, examining it in the firelight. Clean wool, well maintained. It smelled of horses and leather in open air, not of liquor or sweat or the other scents she had come to fear. Moving to the bed, she ran her hand over the simple quilt that covered it. When was the last time she had slept on a real bed? 5 years? Longer? The holding pens had straw if she was lucky, bare ground if she was not. "Shiazi Haguni," she whispered, a greeting to her brother's spirit, whom she had seen standing beside Mason in town. Tarak had been guiding her towards something or someone, and now she was here in this strange man's home. The mark on Sana's neck burned slightly, as it always did when she thought of that day 5 years ago. The day soldiers had come to their village at dawn, firing indiscriminately into teepees where families still slept. The day she had lost everything except her life, and even that had been more curse than blessing in the years that followed. One of the soldiers had held her down and pressed a heated metal stamp to her neck, marking her as property of the 7th Cavalry. She had seen the same mark on the equipment and horses belonging to the unit. In their eyes, she was no different, just another possession to be used and discarded. But this man, this Mason, had not treated her as property, despite the papers that said she was his. He had cut her bonds, given her food and water, offered her his bed while he slept outside. Why? What did he want from her? All men wanted something. Exhaustion finally overcame weariness. and Sana lay down on the bed, keeping her dress and the wool blanket wrapped around her. She would not sleep deeply. She had trained herself over the years to wake at the slightest sound. But she would rest while she could, gathering strength for whatever came next. As sleep began to claim her, Sana saw Tarak again, standing at the foot of the bed. Her brother's spirit smiled at her, then placed a finger to his lips in a gesture of silence, before pointing toward the door where Mason slept outside. Haguni, Tarak's spirit whispered, before fading into the shadows. Sana closed her eyes, the ghost of her brother's smile following her into dreams where mountains reached toward the sky and eagles soared on winds that carried the voices of ancestors. Dawn broke with pale fingers of light reaching across the eastern horizon. Mason woke with the first gray light, his body stiff from the cold ground and his shoulder aching dully. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the familiar sounds of morning. Birds in the cottonwoods, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft whisper of wind through dry grass. Then he remembered his visitor and sat up quickly, looking toward the cabin. The door remained closed, the small window dark. Was she still inside? Had she run during the night? He wouldn't blame her if she had. Mason rolled up his bedding and stood, stretching to ease the tightness in his muscles. He needed coffee before anything else. Moving quietly to the woodpile stacked against the cabin wall, he gathered kindling for the outdoor fire pit, where he could heat water without disturbing the woman if she still slept. As he knelt to arrange the wood, a sound made him turn. The cabin door had opened, and she stood in the doorway, watching him with those unfathomable dark eyes. Her hair was neatly combed, her dress smoothed as best it could be given its poor condition. The wool blanket was folded precisely over one arm. "Good morning," Mason said, feeling strangely awkward on his own property. "Did you sleep?" She said nothing, but inclined her head slightly in what might have been affirmation. "I'm making coffee," he continued, striking a match to light the kindling. "And there's some cornmeal for breakfast." The woman stepped fully outside, closing the door behind her. In the clear morning light, Mason could see details he'd missed the previous day. A small scar above her right eyebrow, the slight unevenness of her shoulders suggesting an old injury, the careful way she held herself, ready to move in any direction if threatened. She approached the fire pit and, to Mason's surprise, gestured toward the coffee pot he had set nearby. Then she pointed to herself, then to the pot again. "You want to make the coffee?" Mason guessed. She nodded once. "All right," he said, handing her the pot. "Water's in the barrel around the side." She took the pot and disappeared around the cabin, returning moments later with it filled. Without prompting, she set it on the metal grate over the now crackling fire, then held out her hand for the coffee. Mason retrieved the pouch of ground beans from his pack and gave it to her. She measured the coffee into the pot with practiced precision, her movements efficient and sure. This was not new to her. "You've done this before," he observed. She glanced at him, then back at the pot, giving no response. As they waited for the coffee to boil, Mason considered how to proceed. He had questions, so many questions, but no way to ask them if she didn't speak English. And even if she did, why would she trust him with answers? "My name is Mason," he said finally, tapping his chest. "Mason Blackwell." The woman looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then to his surprise, she spoke. "Sana," she said quietly, touching her own chest. "Sana no ta." "Sana," Mason repeated, trying to match her pronunciation. "It's good to meet you." The absurdity of the polite greeting in their situation wasn't lost on him. He had literally purchased her the day before. Yet here they were, introducing themselves as though they'd met at a social gathering. Sana turned her attention back to the coffee, which had begun to boil. She removed it from the fire with a folded cloth, letting the ground settle before pouring the dark liquid into the 2 tin cups Mason had set out. They sat on opposite sides of the fire pit, drinking in silence as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the yard. Mason watched as Sana's eyes traveled over the ranch, the corral, the barn, the open land beyond. She was assessing, he realized, learning the territory, identifying escape routes. It's what he would have done in her position. "I need to check on the cattle," Mason said when they had finished their coffee. "You can stay here if you want, or come along, your choice." He wasn't sure how much she understood, but he wanted to make it clear she wasn't a prisoner. Sana studied him for a moment, then stood, setting her empty cup beside the fire. She would come with him, then. Mason saddled Chance while Sana waited nearby, her posture alert, but no longer as rigid with tension as it had been the previous day. When he was ready, he offered her a hand up, which she again declined, mounting the horse on her own. They spent the day in silence, checking on the small herd, mending a broken section of fence, gathering firewood for the coming night. Sana worked alongside Mason without being asked, her movements revealing knowledge of ranch life. She seemed especially at ease with the horses, whispering to them in Apache when she thought Mason wasn't listening. As dusk approached, they returned to the cabin. Mason prepared a simple meal while Sana arranged the firewood they had collected. The domesticity of it felt strange to Mason, the quiet presence of another person in his space after so many years alone. After they ate, Mason found himself reluctant to step outside for the night. Not because of the cold, but because something about Sana's presence was calming in a way he couldn't explain. Like finding an unexpected shelter in the middle of a storm you hadn't realized you were caught in. "I should let you rest," he said finally, gathering his bedroll once more. But Sana shook her head. She pointed to the bearskin rug before the fireplace, then to herself. "You want to sleep there?" Mason frowned. "The bed is more comfortable." Sana's expression remained determined. She made a sweeping gesture toward the window, then mimicked sleep, her hands folded beneath her cheek. Then she pointed to herself, the rug, and made a circular motion with her finger. "You want to take turns sleeping?" Mason guessed. "You'll keep watch first?" She nodded, her dark eyes serious. Mason hesitated. "There's no need. We're safe here." Sana gave him a look that spoke volumes about how little she believed that. After a moment's consideration, Mason nodded. "All right, wake me in a few hours to take my turn." Sana inclined her head in agreement, then settled cross-legged on the rug, her back straight, facing the door. Mason lay down on the bed, keeping his clothes and boots on. Despite his intention to stay alert until Sana woke him for his watch, the exhaustion of the day soon pulled him into sleep. In the deepest part of the night, Mason dreamed. He stood in a village of tipis, smoke rising from cooking fires into a blue summer sky. Children laughed as they chased each other between the dwellings. Women worked at tanning hides or grinding corn. Men gathered around a central fire, talking in low voices. Mason knew this place, knew what was about to happen, wanted to shout a warning but found his voice silenced, his body frozen in place as an observer, unable to intervene. The first shot came from the ridge to the east. A woman fell, blood blooming across her dress like a crimson flower. Then more shots, screams, chaos erupting as cavalry soldiers poured into the village from all sides. Mason watched helplessly as families were cut down, as tipis were set ablaze, as children ran screaming only to be caught and bayoneted by laughing soldiers. He knew these men, had ridden with them, had followed orders until he saw the boy. 10 or 11 years old, standing frozen in shock as his family lay dead around him. A soldier approached from behind, rifle raised, and Mason had finally found his voice, his ability to move. He had turned his own weapon on his comrade, shooting him in the leg, had grabbed the boy, pulling him toward the horses. "Run," he had told him, pressing the reins of a cavalry horse into the child's hands. "Ride north. Don't stop." The boy had looked at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. Then something struck Mason from behind, a blinding pain in his left shoulder. As he fell, he saw the boy gallop away on the stolen horse. At least one would survive, he thought as darkness claimed him. But now in the dream, the scene shifted. The boy turned back, dismounting the horse and walking toward Mason where he lay wounded on the ground. The child's face transformed, hardened, aged. War paint appeared across his features as he knelt beside Mason. "De andi shonshui do shinasha," the boy said, the same words Sana had spoken at the water trough. "The man who killed me will save me." The boy placed his hand on Mason's wounded shoulder, and pain seared through him, jolting him awake with a gasp. Mason sat up in the bed, his heart pounding, sweat cooling on his skin despite the chill in the cabin. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. And there, standing at the foot of his bed, was the boy from his dream, translucent in the firelight, but undeniably present. The spirit raised his hand in greeting, then pointed to where Sana sat by the window, her back to the room, unaware of what transpired behind her. The boy smiled sadly at Mason, then faded from view like morning mist beneath a rising sun. Mason's breath caught in his throat. Had he still been dreaming? No, the chill that remained in the air, the faint scent of sage that had no place in his cabin, told him otherwise. He had seen a spirit, the ghost of a child from the massacre. Sana's brother, perhaps? The similarity in their features was unmistakable. And somehow, impossibly, Mason had recognized him. The boy he had tried to save that day, who he had believed escaped. Had the child died after all? Or was this some other Mara from the same village, with the same features? Mason rubbed his face, trying to clear his mind. He was a practical man, not given to superstition or fancy. And yet, Sana turned from the window, perhaps sensing his wakefulness. Her eyes gleamed in the low firelight, revealing nothing of her thoughts. Had she seen the spirit too? Did she know what Mason had just witnessed? "Your turn to rest," Mason said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. "I'll keep watch now." Sana studied his face for a long moment, as though reading something there that he himself couldn't see. Then she nodded, moving gracefully to the bearskin rug and lying down, her back to the fire, facing the door as though even in sleep she would not fully let down her guard. Mason moved to the window, taking up the position Sana had vacated. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars burning with fierce brightness in the black sky. Somewhere in that vastness, he thought, were answers to the questions that now plagued him. Who was the ghost boy? What did his appearance mean? And why had he been drawn to Sana at the auction? Of all the people in that town, the mark on his shoulder throbbed with phantom pain, echoing the wound from his dream, the same mark that Sana bore on her neck. Not coincidence. Something more. A connection, a shared history, a debt perhaps. As dawn approached, Mason made a silent vow. He would protect this woman, help her find whatever peace she sought, whatever answer she needed. Not out of guilt, though God knew he carried enough of that, but because something in her quiet dignity, her resilience, called to something in himself that he had thought long dead. And if spirits walked between them, bearing messages he couldn't yet understand, then he would listen, would try to hear what the dead had to say to the living, would try to make right what had been so terribly wrong. The first light of morning touched the eastern horizon, painting the land in shades of gold and promise. A new day. And for the first time in years, Mason felt something stir within him that might, if he dared to name it, be called hope. The morning after his ghostly encounter, Mason moved through his tasks with a distracted mind. The vision of the spirit boy lingered, as real in memory as the cold mountain air that filled his lungs. Sana worked alongside him, her movements efficient and purposeful, showing no sign of fatigue despite her interrupted sleep. They were checking the western fence line when Mason spotted the tracks, large paw prints pressed into the soft earth. Mountain lions, 2 sets of them, circling toward where his small herd grazed in the valley below. "Trouble," he muttered, pointing to the tracks. Sana knelt beside the prints, her fingers hovering just above the indentations. She nodded gravely, then held up 2 fingers. 2 cats, Mason confirmed, heading for the cattle. He pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard, checking that it was loaded. The mountain lions were likely starving as winter approached, desperate enough to risk attacking livestock in daylight. He couldn't blame the animals for their hunger, but he couldn't afford to lose any cattle either. Sana touched his arm lightly to get his attention, then pointed to herself, then to a rocky outcropping to the east of the valley. She made a circling motion with her finger, then pointed to Mason and gestured toward the western approach. "You want us to split up," Mason realized. "Flank them from both sides." She nodded, then made a gesture like shooing something away. "Just scare them off, not kill them," Mason translated. "But you're unarmed." Sana bent and picked up several fist-sized rocks, slipping them into the pockets of her dress. Her confidence was obvious. She had done this before. Mason hesitated, then pulled a hunting knife from his belt and offered it to her. "Handle first." "Just in case," he said. Sana accepted the knife after only a moment's hesitation, testing its weight and balance with a practiced hand. Then she was moving, gliding between the scattered junipers with silent grace, making her way toward the eastern ridge. Mason watched her go, admiring her woodcraft. Then he mounted Chance and rode wide around the valley, approaching from the west as Sana had suggested. Through his field glass, he could see the cattle growing restless, several of them looking nervously toward a thicket of scrub oak at the valley's edge. The cats would be there, preparing to ambush any animal that strayed too close. Mason dismounted, tethering Chance to a sturdy pine well away from the anticipated action. He moved forward on foot, rifle ready but not yet raised. If they could scare the predators away without gunfire, so much the better. Gunshots might panic the cattle, causing them to stampede across the rough terrain. As he neared the thicket, Mason caught a glimpse of tawny fur, a mountain lion crouched in the shadows, its attention fixed on the grazing herd. It was gaunt, ribs visible beneath its hide, eyes gleaming with hunger. Mason scanned the area but couldn't spot the second cat. It would be nearby, though. Mountain lions sometimes hunted in loose cooperation when prey was scarce. He was about to advance when a sound from the eastern ridge made both him and the mountain lion turn. A strange, undulating cry split the air. Sana, making a sound that raised the hair on the back of Mason's neck. It was followed by a clatter of stones as she sent a cascade of rocks tumbling down the slope. The mountain lion in the thicket tensed, torn between the cattle it had been stalking and this new threat. Mason seized the moment, stepping into the open and raising his rifle, not to shoot but to appear larger, more threatening. He shouted, the sound echoing across the small valley. Caught between two threats, the mountain lion made its decision. It turned and bounded away from both the cattle and the humans, disappearing into the brush at the far end of the valley. Mason was about to call out to Sana when he heard a snarl from above. The second mountain lion, larger than the first, with a scarred face suggesting past battles, had been positioned on a ledge above the valley. Now it was crouched, facing Sana, who stood on the ridge with knife in hand. Without thinking, Mason raised his rifle, but before he could take aim, Sana acted. She threw one of her rocks with astonishing accuracy, hitting the big cat directly on its sensitive nose. The animal yowled in pain and confusion, then turned and bounded away, following its companion into the wilderness. For a moment, Mason and Sana stood frozen, watching to ensure the predators were truly gone. Then Mason lowered his rifle, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When he looked up at the ridge again, Sana was smiling, a small, subtle curve of her lips, but the first true smile he had seen from her. Something in Mason's chest tightened at the sight. She made her way down the rocky slope with nimble grace, rejoining him beside the thicket. That was impressive, Mason said, genuinely admiring her skill. You've done this before. Sana handed him back his knife, nodding once in acknowledgement of both his praise and his question. She looked toward the cattle, now settled back to grazing, the danger past. Then she pointed to the mountain lion tracks and made a gesture that suggested returning, raising her eyebrows in question. Will they come back? Mason translated. Probably. They're hungry and winter's coming, but they'll be more cautious next time. Sana considered this, then pointed to Mason's rifle and shook her head. She mimed throwing something, then pointed to her ears. You want to use noise instead of guns, Mason interpreted. Scare them off without shooting. She nodded, then knelt and began gathering more rocks, creating a small pile. She pointed to various spots around the valley's edge, suggesting places to leave caches of stones for future use. Good idea, Mason agreed. We'll set up noisemakers around the perimeter, less risky than bullets flying near the herd. They spent the next hour placing piles of rocks at strategic points, along with some improvised noisemakers Mason constructed from tin cans and bits of metal that would rattle in the wind or when pulled by a string. Simple deterrents, but often effective against predators that preferred easier, less noisy prey. As they worked, Mason found himself repeatedly glancing at Sana, seeing her in a new light. She wasn't just surviving, she was actively helping, offering solutions, working as a partner rather than a captive. And she had positioned herself between danger and his livelihood without hesitation. Why? What did she gain from helping him protect his cattle? She owed him nothing. If anything, as a white man, he represented everything that had destroyed her people. The ghost boy's words echoed in Mason's mind. The man who killed me will save me. Did Sana know about his past? About his role in the massacre? About his attempt to save at least one child from the slaughter? These questions circled in his thoughts as they rode back to the cabin, side by side now on separate horses. Mason had given Sana the mare, Belle, seeing her comfort and skill with the animal. She rode confidently, back straight, eyes alert to their surroundings. No longer a prisoner being transported, but a free woman choosing her path. At least, Mason hoped that's how she saw it. He had the legal papers declaring her his property, but in his mind, those meant nothing. She was her own person, free to stay or leave as she chose. He would make that clear to her somehow, despite the language barrier between them. As they approached the cabin, Mason noticed Sana tense slightly, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. Following her line of sight, he spotted a dust cloud on the horizon, riders heading their way. Visitors were rare at the isolated ranch, and rarely welcome. "Let's get inside," Mason said, spurring Chance to a faster pace. They stabled the horses quickly, then entered the cabin. Mason checked his rifle and pistol, laying them ready on the table. Sana moved to the window, watching the approaching riders with narrowed eyes. "Probably just Jim Harris," Mason said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Or traders passing through." Sana shook her head slightly, her expression grave. She held up 5 fingers, then closed them into a fist and tapped her chest over her heart. "5 men," Mason translated, "and you have a bad feeling about them." She nodded, then moved away from the window to avoid being seen. Taking a piece of charcoal from beside the fireplace, she knelt and drew a quick symbol on the floorboards, the crossed arrow and star that marked both her neck and Mason's shoulder. Then she looked up at him, eyes questioning. Mason's breath caught. She knew. Somehow, she knew about his past connection to the cavalry unit that had destroyed her village. Yet here she was, not attacking him or fleeing, but warning him of danger, helping him prepare. "Yes," he said quietly, touching his own shoulder where the brand lay hidden beneath his shirt. "I was with them. But I—" He was cut off by the sound of hooves in the yard, followed by men's voices. There was no time for explanations now. Sana quickly erased the symbol with her foot, then positioned herself in the corner of the room, away from both door and windows, knife held low against her skirt where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Mason moved to the door, opening it before the visitors could knock. Better to face whatever was coming on his terms in his doorway. 5 men sat on horseback in his yard, as Sana had predicted. 4 were rough-looking types, trail dust on their clothes, guns on their hips, hard eyes scanning the property with the calculating gaze of men assessing what could be taken. But it was the 5th man who drew Mason's attention. Older than the others, with silver at his temples and a cavalry officer's bearing, despite his civilian clothes. There was something familiar about him, something that made Mason's old wound ache with remembered pain. "Afternoon," Mason said, keeping his voice neutral. "Something I can help you with, gentlemen." The older man urged his horse forward a few steps. "Looking for a man named Blackwell. That would be you, I take it?" Mason nodded once, not offering further information. His right hand rested casually near the pistol at his hip. "Name's Wallace," the man continued. "Sheriff Emmett Wallace out of Copper Ridge. These men are deputized to assist me." He gestured to his companions, though no badges were visible on any of them. "We're looking for stolen property. An Apache woman taken from town yesterday." "Not stolen," Mason replied evenly. "Purchased, legal and proper, with papers to prove it." Wallace's mouth tightened. "Papers or not, there's been a complaint. That woman was promised to another buyer before you interfered. We've come to correct the misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Mason said. "I outbid everyone fair and square. The auctioneer took my money, gave me the papers. Transaction complete." "The woman inside?" Wallace asked, ignoring Mason's response. "Or did she run off already? They usually do. You know, ungrateful savages." Mason felt a cold anger settle in his gut. This wasn't about legal ownership or prior agreements. This was about power, about a man used to taking what he wanted and eliminating any who stood in his way. "She's not your concern," Mason said. "I suggest you and your deputies turn around and head back to town." Wallace's expression hardened. "Careful, Blackwell. You're speaking to an officer of the law." "I'm speaking to a man trespassing on private property," Mason countered. "State your legal business or leave." A tense silence stretched between them. Then Wallace smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You know, you look familiar," he said conversationally. "Served in the army, did you? Cavalry, perhaps?" Mason kept his face impassive, though his pulse quickened. "A long time ago. 7th Cavalry Scout Division, if I'm not mistaken," Wallace continued. "Under Colonel Hargrove. I was a captain then." His eyes narrowed. "Now I remember. You're the scout who went soft during the Chiricahua campaign. Shot one of our own men, tried to help those savages escape." The pieces fell into place. Captain Wallace, now Sheriff Wallace, had been there that day, had given the order to fire on women and children, had been the one to shoot Mason when he tried to save the boy. "That's not how I remember it," Mason said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I remember soldiers murdering unarmed civilians. Women. Children. I remember a massacre, not a battle." Wallace's face darkened. "Watch your mouth, boy. Those Apache were hostiles, every last one of them. We had orders to clean out that nest of vipers, and that's what we did. Would have been a clean operation if you hadn't interfered." Mason's hand tightened on his pistol. "State your business or leave," he repeated. "You've got no authority here." Wallace studied him for a long moment, then nodded as though coming to a decision. "We'll be back, Blackwell, with more men. That Apache woman is coming with us, one way or another. And maybe we'll have a conversation about harboring enemies of the United States while we're at it." He turned his horse, signaling his men to do the same. As they rode away, Wallace called back over his shoulder, "Sleep light, Scout. Frontier justice has a way of finding traitors eventually." Mason watched until they disappeared over the rise, then closed the door, his hands shaking with suppressed fury and something else. Fear, not for himself, but for Sana. Wallace wouldn't stop. Men like him never did. He turned to find Sana watching him, her dark eyes unreadable. She had understood enough of the exchange, it seemed. She pointed to Wallace's retreating form, then made a cutting motion across her throat, raising her eyebrows in question. "Yes," Mason confirmed grimly. "He means to kill us both." Sana nodded, unsurprised. She moved to the table and sat, gesturing for Mason to join her. There was a new determination in her expression, a decision made. Mason sat across from her, uncertain what would come next. To his surprise, Sana reached across the table and touched his wounded shoulder lightly, directly over the brand that matched the one on her neck. Then she touched her own neck, establishing the connection between them. "De ahandi shon shui du shinasha," she said again, the same words she had spoken at the water trough. Then, to his astonishment, she continued in halting English. "Man who kill me will save me." Mason stared at her, stunned. "You speak English?" Sana nodded slightly. "Some. Learn in prison." She touched his shoulder again. "You try save Tarek, my brother. The ghost boy, the child Mason had tried to help escape during the massacre. He died," Mason said softly, the words heavy with regret. But Sana shook her head. "No die. Spirits show me. Tarek live." Mason's heart raced. If the boy had survived, if he was still alive somewhere. "Where is he, do you know?" Sana closed her eyes briefly as though listening to a distant voice. "Church, White Father, Saint Francis. St. Francis Mission. It was about 3 days' ride to the north near Santa Fe. If the boy had made it that far on the horse Mason had given him, the priest might have taken him in, might have protected him from soldiers looking to finish their grim work. "We'll find him," Mason promised, the words coming without conscious thought. "Together." Sana studied his face, searching for something. Truth, perhaps, or courage. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once decisively. "Wallace, come back," she said. "Soon, many men." "Tonight?" Mason asked. Sana shook her head. 2 days, need more men. 2 days to prepare then, to decide whether to stand and fight or flee, to plan for either possibility. "Why did you stay?" Mason asked, the question that had been bothering him since she'd first chosen to help with the mountain lions. "You could have run, still can." Sana was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, each word was carefully chosen, her English improving as she gained confidence. "Spirit of Tarek, bring me to you. Say you will help. Say you try. Save him before." "I did." Mason said softly. I tried. I didn't know if he survived. I see, Sana said, tapping her temple. In here. See past. See you fight other white men. Try help children escape. Mason's throat tightened with emotion. Not enough of them. I couldn't save them all. Sana's eyes held no accusation, only a deep understanding that humbled him. One life is enough. They sat in silence for a time, the weight of shared history between them. Finally, Mason spoke. We should prepare for when Wallace returns. Sana nodded, rising from the table with new purpose. She moved to the window, scanning the horizon, then pointed toward the mountains to the northwest. Go there. High ground, caves, places to hide, watch who comes. It was a good strategy, better than trying to defend the isolated cabin against superior numbers. The mountains offered caves, hidden valleys, places where two people who knew the terrain could evade or ambush pursuers. Mason knew those highlands well from hunting trips. Sana, with her Apache upbringing, would know how to move through such country even better. We'll leave tomorrow at first light, Mason decided. Take supplies, ammunition, both horses, cash, what we can't carry. They spent the remainder of the day in preparation. Mason collected ammunition, food, water skins, medical supplies, the essentials for survival in the wild. Sana mended a spare set of clothes Mason provided, adapting them to fit her smaller frame. They worked together with the silent efficiency of people accustomed to hardship, to making do with little. As dusk approached, Mason built a fire outside rather than in the hearth, cooking a simple meal of beans and cornbread. They sat side by side on a log, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky. The cave system up there, Mason said, pointing toward the distant peaks now silhouetted against the last light of sunset, has a multiple exits, water source inside, good defensive position if it comes to that. Sana nodded, her expression thoughtful. How will you know Wallace? Before, at village. Mason stared into the fire, the memories he'd tried to bury rising like smoke. I was a scout for the 7th Cavalry, enlisted after the war, when there weren't many other options for a man with no family, no land. Was good at tracking, at reading sign, at finding water in dry country. They paid me to find things. People. He paused, the words sticking in his throat. I didn't know at first what they planned for the Apache we tracked. They talked about reservations, about peaceful relocation. But that day, at your village, there was no warning, no chance for surrender, just slaughter. Sana's face remained impassive, but her eyes reflected the firelight like banked coals. You fight them, your own people. It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. Too late. Should have seen it coming, should have refused the mission. By the time I understood what was happening, most of your people were already dead. I managed to get to one boy, Tarak, you say his name is, gave him a horse, told him to ride north. His hand rose unconsciously to his left shoulder. Wallace shot me for it, would have killed me, but the colonel stopped him. Said I'd face court-martial instead. Dishonorable discharge was the sentence. Better than I deserved. Why you help? Sana asked quietly. Risk your life for Apache boy? Mason considered the question, searching for an answer he himself had never fully understood. Because it was wrong, because he was just a child, because in that moment, nothing mattered except trying to save at least one innocent life from that hell. He met her gaze directly. I've carried the faces of those who died that day with me ever since. In my dreams, in my waking hours. Never thought I'd meet a survivor. Few survive, Sana said, her voice hollow with memory. Soldiers kill most, take some women, children prisoner, put in cages like animals, sell some, like me. She touched the brand on her neck. Mark us, property of army. Anger flared in Mason's chest at the matter-of-fact way she described such atrocities. That ends now, he said fiercely. You're not property, not mine, not anyone's. Those papers they gave me, they mean nothing. You're free to go wherever you want, do whatever you choose. Sana studied him, something softening in her expression. I stay, for now. Find Tarak first, then decide. Agreed, Mason said. We find your brother. After that, Whatever you want to do, wherever you want to go, I'll help if I can." They fell silent, watching the fire burn down to embers. The night was clear and cold, stars emerging like distant campfires across the vast darkness above. In the stillness, Mason felt a strange peace settle over him. Whatever came next would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. Wallace and his men would show no mercy, but for the first time in years, Mason felt he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing precisely what he was meant to do. He glanced at Sana's profile, outlined in the fading firelight. She sat straight-backed, proud, her eyes reflecting the starlight above. Not a victim, despite all that had been done to her. A survivor, a warrior, and now, perhaps, an ally. Or something more. Mason pushed the thought away. Such considerations were for peacetime, for a future neither of them might live to see. "We should rest," he said finally. "Long ride tomorrow." Sana nodded, rising with fluid grace. "I take first watch, you sleep." Mason wanted to protest, to insist that she rest while he kept guard, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. They were partners now, equals in this venture. He would respect her choice. "Wake me in 4 hours," he said. "I'll take second watch." Inside the cabin, Mason lay on the bed, rifle within easy reach. Through the window, he could see Sana sitting on the porch, a dark silhouette against the starlit yard. Alert, vigilant, unafraid despite all she had endured. Sleep came more easily than Mason had expected, perhaps because for the first time in years he wasn't keeping watch alone. The dream came again that night. The village, the massacre, the boy escaping on horseback. But this time, when Mason lay wounded on the ground, the scene shifted differently. The boy grew older, his face changing into that of a young man, 16, perhaps 17. No longer in Apache dress, but wearing the plain clothing of a mission school, looking directly at Mason with eyes that held recognition, fear, hope. Then the young man's face morphed again, becoming the painted visage of the spirit boy Mason had seen in the cabin. The ghost spoke, his voice echoing as though from a great distance. "Shiashi, Nihonyo Nahastian." Words Mason didn't understand, yet somehow comprehended their meaning. "Brother, the path is open." Mason woke with a start, the dream fragments clinging to his consciousness like cobwebs. The cabin was dark, the fire burned down to faint embers. According to the position of the stars visible through the window, he'd slept far longer than the agreed-upon 4 hours. He rose quickly, concerned that Sana had not woken him for his watch. Had she fallen asleep at her post? Or worse, had Wallace returned earlier than expected? Moving silently to the door, Mason peered outside. The porch was empty, the yard still. His heart rate accelerated. Where was she? Then he caught a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision. Turning, he saw Sana kneeling in the shadow of the barn, her hands raised, palms open to the night sky. Her lips moved in silent prayer or invocation. And around her, impossible, yet Mason could not deny what his eyes perceived. Faint shapes shimmered in the darkness. Translucent figures of men, women, children, standing in a circle around her, their forms wavering like heat mirages above desert sand. The spirit boy was among them, standing closest to Sana, his painted face solemn as he listened to her whispered words. Then, as Mason watched, frozen in the doorway, the boy turned and looked directly at him. A smile touched the ghost's lips, and he raised his hand in greeting or blessing. The other spirits followed his gaze, dozens of insubstantial eyes now fixed on Mason. He felt their attention like a physical touch, not hostile but evaluating, judging. He resisted the urge to step back into the cabin, to shut the door against this impossible vision. Instead, he straightened his spine and met their ghostly regard steadily. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the spirits began to fade, dissolving into the night air until only the boy remained. He nodded once to Mason, a gesture that felt like acceptance. Then he too disappeared. Sana remained kneeling for a moment longer, then rose and turned toward the cabin. She showed no surprise at seeing Mason in the doorway, as though she had been aware of his presence all along. "You should be sleeping," Mason said quietly as she approached. "Spirits restless tonight," Sana replied, her English flowing more naturally than before. "Need to speak with them. Ask for guidance. Protection." Mason hesitated, then decided there was no point pretending he hadn't seen what had just transpired. "I saw them. The spirits. The boy. Tarak's ghost. Sana nodded, unsurprised by his admission. His spirit can walk between worlds, shows himself to those with open eyes. She studied Mason's face in the starlight. Few white men can see the spirits. You have. Gift. Not a gift I ever asked for, Mason said, unsettled by the idea. Not ask, born with. In your blood, perhaps. Sana moved past him into the cabin. Many things we do not choose. Choose only what to do with what is given. Mason followed her inside, closing the door against the night chill. What did they tell you? The spirits. Sana lit a small candle, its flame casting elongated shadows across the cabin walls. Say danger comes sooner than we think. Say we must leave at first light. Say, she paused, looking at Mason directly, say you are needed. For what comes next? Needed how? Mason asked, a sense of foreboding settling in his gut. To find Tarak. To face Wallace. Sana's eyes reflected the candle's flame, twin points of light in the darkness. To heal old wounds. Yours, mine, my people's. It seemed an impossible task for one man, especially a man with Mason's history. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of healing, he said honestly. Not choose you, Sana replied simply. Spirits choose. I accept. She extinguished the candle with a soft breath. Rest now, I watch until dawn. Mason wanted to protest, to insist that she sleep while he took his turn at guard duty, but something in her manner suggested this was not negotiable. Perhaps communion with the spirits had given her strength that transcended physical need. Or perhaps, more prosaically, she simply didn't trust sleep in a white man's cabin, regardless of his apparent good intentions. He returned to the bed, lying down but not expecting to find rest again. Yet despite the lingering strangeness of what he had witnessed, despite the knowledge of danger approaching with the dawn, sleep reclaimed him with surprising ease. His last thought before consciousness faded was of the spirit boy's smile, a gesture of forgiveness he had never dared hope for, yet now received from the most unexpected quarter. They left at first light, riding away from the cabin with nothing but what they could carry on horseback. Mason had cached some supplies in the barn loft, buried others near landmarks he could find again if they returned. If. The word hung unspoken between them as they rode northwest, toward the distant mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the pale morning sky. Sana rode slightly ahead, her posture relaxed but alert, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. She had adapted Mason's spare clothes, a flannel shirt, canvas trousers, and a battered sheepskin coat, to fit her smaller frame. With her hair braided and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, she might pass for a young ranch hand at a distance. Close up, no one would mistake her heritage, but the disguise might buy precious moments if they encountered strangers on the trail. They avoided the main trails, keeping to game paths and dry washes where their tracks would be harder to follow. By midday, they had reached the first foothills, the terrain growing steadily more rugged, offering better cover but slower progress. As they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream, Mason studied the landscape behind them through his field glass. No dust clouds, no sign of pursuit yet. But Wallace would come. The question was whether he would track them into the mountains or wait at the cabin, expecting them to return for the cached supplies. He will follow, Sana said, reading his thoughts. Not give up. Too much pride. Mason lowered the glass, nodding grimly. And too much at stake. If word got out about what really happened at your village, about what they're doing to Apache prisoners, there are still some in Washington who might care. Few care about Apache, Sana said matter-of-factly. But Wallace fear you, white man who knows truth, who can speak to other white men. It was a shrewd assessment. Wallace could dismiss any accusations from Apache survivors as the lies of savages. But a former scout, a decorated veteran, that testimony might be harder to ignore, especially with the growing reform movement in the East, where newspapers regularly criticize the Army's handling of the Indian question. We'll reach the cave system by nightfall, Mason said, changing the subject. If they're following, they won't try the mountains in darkness. We'll have until morning to prepare. They continued their journey, climbing steadily higher as the afternoon wore on. The air grew cooler, the vegetation changing from desert scrub to pine and juniper. Game trails narrowed, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through particularly treacherous sections. Twice, Sana halted suddenly, head cocked as though listening to something beyond Mason's perception. Each time, she changed their course slightly, avoiding what looked to Mason like perfectly passable terrain. "What is it?" he asked after the second detour. "You hear something?" Sana shook her head. "Not here. Feel. Bad places. Where spirits restless, angry." She looked at him, gauging his reaction. "You think me crazy? Superstitious?" "No," Mason said truthfully. "After what I've seen, I'm in no position to doubt you." A faint smile touched her lips, there and gone so quickly Mason wondered if he had imagined it. But something had shifted between them. A new understanding, a deepening trust. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they reached a narrow canyon that cut deeply into the mountainside. Sana pointed to a nearly invisible trail that switched back up the canyon wall. "Cave there," she said. "Good place. Water inside. Many ways out." Mason was impressed. He knew of the cave system, had sheltered there during hunting trips, but the approach Sana indicated was unknown to him. "How did you find this trail? You've been here before?" "No," Sana replied. "Spirits show me, last night." Of course. The ghostly gathering Mason had witnessed. Apparently it had been more than just communion. It had been reconnaissance. They made their way carefully up the treacherous path, the horses picking their steps with the caution of animals who understand that a misstep means death. Near the top, the trail widened into a small plateau before disappearing into a dark opening in the rock face, the cave entrance, partially concealed by a growth of scrub pine. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. Mason lit a small lantern he'd brought, revealing a spacious cavern with a ceiling high enough to stand comfortably. The air was dry and surprisingly fresh, suggesting good ventilation. At the back, a small spring emerged from the rock, forming a clear pool before disappearing again beneath the cave floor. "Perfect," Mason said, surveying their shelter with approval. "Defensible entrance, water source, multiple chambers." He pointed to a narrow fissure at the far end of the cavern. "That passage leads to an upper exit on the ridge. Good escape route if needed." They unsaddled the horses, setting up a small camp near the spring. There was enough forage just outside the cave to keep the animals fed, and the plateau offered sufficient space for them to move around without risking a fall. As darkness fell, Mason built a small fire, positioning it where its light wouldn't be visible from below. They ate a simple meal of jerky, hardtack, and coffee, the flames casting long shadows against the cave walls. "Tomorrow," Mason said, planning aloud, "we should scout the canyon, set some early warning systems. Deadfalls, trip lines, nothing lethal, just enough to alert us if anyone approaches." He glanced at Sana. "Unless the spirits will warn us." She considered this, her face solemn in the firelight. "Spirits help, yes, but not always. Clear. Better to have warnings we can see, hear." Mason nodded, relieved by her practical approach. For all her spiritual connections, Sana was grounded in reality, in survival. "After we secure this place," he continued, "we should discuss the next stage. Getting to St. Francis Mission, finding Tarak." He hesitated, then added, "and dealing with Wallace, if he follows us that far." Sana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice had a distant quality, as though she were translating concepts that existed beyond language. "Wallace must answer for what he did, what he ordered." Her eyes, when she raised them to meet Mason's gaze, held a determination that was neither hatred nor vengeance, but something more elemental. Justice. "Not just for my village, for all Apache he hurt. All he will hurt if not stopped." Mason couldn't disagree. Wallace was dangerous, not just to them, but to any Apache unfortunate enough to cross his path. And if he truly was using his position as sheriff to continue his campaign of violence under the guise of law, he was a threat to the fragile peace of the entire territory. "We'll find a way," Mason promised. "First Tarak, then Wallace, one step at a time." Sana nodded, seemingly satisfied with this approach. She rose, moving to the cave entrance to gaze out at the star-filled sight. Mason remained by the fire, watching her silhouette against the night beyond. She stood perfectly still, communing with the darkness in that way she had, listening perhaps to voices Mason could only sometimes hear. After a time, she returned to the fire, her expression troubled. "Spirits restless again. Say danger closer than we think." Mason tensed, hand moving instinctively to his rifle. Wallace? Already? Sana shook her head. Not Wallace. Different danger. She frowned, struggling to translate what she had sensed. Something wrong, out of place. She touched her chest over her heart. Feel it here. Bad spirit, maybe. Very old, very angry. Mason had been prepared for pursuit, for a confrontation with Wallace and his men. But this was something else entirely. Something beyond his experience. What do we do? Stay alert. Stay together. Sana met his eyes steadily. Trust each other. It was as much a question as a statement. Could they trust each other? This unlikely pair thrown together by circumstance and spirits? A white ex-soldier carrying the guilt of a massacre and an Apache woman bearing the scars of that same atrocity? I trust you, Mason said, the words simple but profound in their implications. Sana studied him for a long moment, as though searching for any hint of deception. Then she nodded once, decisively. I trust you also, Mason Blackwell, with my life. She paused, then added softly, with my brother's life. The weight of that trust settled on Mason's shoulders, not as a burden but as an honor. He wasn't sure he deserved yet, was determined to earn. Whatever dangers lay ahead, Wallace and his men, the mysterious threat Sana sensed, the challenges of finding Tarak and securing his freedom, they would face them together. As they prepared for sleep, taking turns at watch as had become their custom, Mason found himself thinking of the spirit boy's words in his dream. Brother, the path is open. Perhaps the path was not just toward finding Tarak, but towards some larger reconciliation between Mason and his past, between two peoples divided by violence and misunderstanding. It seemed an impossible hope in this harsh land where blood had soaked the earth for generations. And yet, as Mason took his position at the cave entrance for the first watch, gazing out at the vast, star-strewn sky, he allowed himself to imagine such a possibility. A future where the ghosts of the past might finally rest, where the living might find a way forward together. A foolish dream, perhaps, but it was his, and for now it was enough to keep watch by. Dawn broke over the mountains in ribbons of gold and crimson, illuminating the canyon below their cave shelter. Mason stood at the entrance, rifle cradled in his arms, watching as the shadows retreated from the valley floor. He had taken the final watch, allowing Sana a few hours of uninterrupted rest before the challenges that lay ahead. Behind him, he heard her stirring. She moved almost silently, even in wakefulness, a habit born of years where making noise could mean death. Within moments, she was beside him at the cave entrance, her dark eyes scanning the landscape with the focus of a hunter. No sign of pursuit, Mason said quietly, but that doesn't mean they're not coming. Sana nodded, her gaze fixed on a point in the distance. They come, not today, tomorrow, perhaps. Wallace gathers more men first. How can you be sure? Mason asked, though he was learning not to question her insights. She touched her temple lightly. Dreams tell me, spirits show paths people walk before they walk them. She turned to look at him directly. Today, we prepare. Tomorrow we go to St. Francis. Mason raised an eyebrow. I thought we'd wait here. Let Wallace pass by while we stay hidden. Sana shook her head firmly. No time. Tarak in danger now. Her expression grew distant, troubled. Dreams show him afraid. Others watching him. Bad men. Mason considered this. If Wallace had somehow learned of Tarak's existence, of his connection to the massacre 5 years ago, the boy would indeed be in danger. A surviving witness, old enough now to testify about what had happened, Wallace would see him as a threat to be eliminated. The mission is 3 days' ride from here, Mason said, calculating. If we push hard, travel at night. 2 days, Sana corrected. No faster way. Through mountains. She gestured to the peaks rising to the north. Apache paths, no roads, no white men. Mason nodded, trusting her knowledge. We'll need supplies. I'll hunt this morning while you prepare what we have. They moved efficiently, falling into the rhythm of partnership that had begun to feel natural despite the short time they'd known each other. Mason brought down a small deer in a ravine near the cave, field dressing it and smoking the meat over a carefully controlled fire that produced minimal smoke. Meanwhile, Sana crafted additional arrows for the bow she'd made from a flexible juniper branch and sinew, preparing for a journey where gunshots might attract unwanted attention. By midday, they were ready, supplies packed, weapons prepared, route planned using a crude map Mason drew in the dirt, and Sana modified with her superior knowledge of the mountain passes. They would travel light and fast, using game trails and ancient Apache pathways that wound through the mountains like veins through living stone. As they prepared to depart, Sana knelt at the cave entrance, removing a small pouch from around her neck. From it, she took a pinch of yellow powder, corn pollen, Mason realized, and sprinkled it in a circle around herself, murmuring words in Apache. Prayer for safe journey, she explained, seeing Mason's curious expression. Ask mountain spirits for protection, permission to pass. Mason waited respectfully until she had finished. He had seen too much in recent days to doubt the efficacy of such rituals. If there were indeed spirits in these mountains, and he was increasingly certain there were, better to have them as allies than enemies. They left the cave as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, leading their horses down the treacherous switchback trail to the canyon floor. Once on level ground, they mounted and headed north, staying within the shadows of the rock walls as long as possible. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they ascended into the high country. Narrow passes where they had to dismount and lead the horses, sheer drops that required careful navigation, swift running streams fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Yet Sana moved through this rugged landscape with the confidence of one returning to familiar territory, finding paths where Mason saw only impassable wilderness. They made camp that night in a small, protected hollow beside a spring, building no fire despite the cold that settled around them like a living presence. Instead, they huddled beneath shared blankets, preserving warmth and keeping watch in shifts. During his watch, Mason found his thoughts turning to the mission that lay ahead. What would they find at St. Francis? Would Tarak remember his sister after 5 years of separation? Would he even remember the massacre, or had those memories been mercifully buried beneath the routines of mission life? And what of Wallace? How close was he to discovering the boy's existence, his location? When Sana woke to take her turn at watch, Mason asked the question that had been troubling him. If Tarak has been at the mission all this time, safe and cared for, why take him away now? Why not leave him there, where Wallace might never find him? Sana's expression grew solemn in the starlight. He is Apache, should know his people, his ways. Mission takes this. She touched her heart, makes him forget who he is, where he comes from. Her voice softened. He is my brother, last of my blood, should be with family. Mason understood. The missions, a mission, for all their good intentions, were instruments of assimilation, places where native children were taught to speak English, practice Christianity, and adopt white customs while forgetting their own heritage. He had seen the results. Young men and women caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. We'll find him, Mason promised. Bring him home. Sana nodded, her eyes reflecting the distant stars. Yes, home. But whether she meant the Apache lands that had once been theirs or somewhere else entirely, Mason couldn't tell. They rose before dawn and continued north, the mountains gradually giving way to high plateau country as they approached the territorial border. By midday of the second day, they caught sight of their destination, the whitewashed walls of St. Francis Mission standing stark against the red earth of a small valley. From their vantage point on a ridge overlooking the settlement, Mason studied the layout through his field glass. The mission complex consisted of a small chapel, a 2-story building that likely served as dormitory and schoolhouse, several outbuildings, and cultivated fields where figures, students he presumed, worked under supervision. How do we approach? He asked, handing the glass to Sana. We can't simply ride up and demand they hand over Tarak. The priests will have legal guardianship by now. Sana surveyed the mission, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Night, she said finally. Wait until dark. I go alone, find Tarak, speak to him. If he wants to come, we take him. If not, she paused, the possibility clearly painful to consider. If not, we leave him. His choice. Mason nodded, respecting her decision. Freedom had to mean something, even, perhaps especially when it came at great personal cost. I'll cover you from the ridge. If there's trouble, I'll create a distraction. They retreated to a sheltered ravine half a mile from the mission, making camp for the remaining daylight hours. As they waited for nightfall, Mason noticed Sana growing increasingly quiet, her gaze fixed on the distant mission walls. There was tension in her posture, a tightly controlled anxiety he hadn't seen in her before. "You're worried about what you'll find," he observed, "about whether he'll remember you." Sana looked at him, surprise briefly crossing her features before she composed herself. "Yes," she admitted. 5 years. Long time. He was young, only 11. Maybe forget language, forget family. Maybe, she hesitated, the words difficult. Maybe hate Apache now. Think white way better. Mason had seen it happen. Native children raised in schools and missions who grew ashamed of their heritage, who rejected tribal ways in favor of white society's approval. It was, in many ways, more tragic than outright violence, this slow erosion of identity, of belonging. "Whatever happens," he said, "whatever he chooses, you found him. That's something many never get." Sana nodded, though the worry didn't leave her eyes. As the sun began to set, she removed her borrowed clothes, changing back into her original dress, which she had carried in her pack. The garment had been washed and mended as best she could manage, but it was unmistakably Apache in design. "Want him to see me as I am," she explained, "not pretending to be what I'm not." Mason understood. This meeting was about truth, about honoring who they were to each other. Disguises had no place in such a reunion. As darkness fell, they moved closer to the mission, leaving the horses tethered in the ravine. From the cover of a juniper grove, they watched as lamps were lit in the buildings, as evening prayers were conducted in the chapel, as students filed from the dormitory to the dining hall and back again under the watchful eyes of black-robed priests. "There," Sana whispered suddenly, pointing to a slender youth walking slightly apart from the others. "Tarak." Mason followed her gaze. The boy, no young man now, was taller than his peers, with the same high cheekbones and straight bearing as his sister. He wore the standard mission uniform of plain trousers and white shirt, his black hair cut short in the white man style. Yet something in his movements, in the way he held himself slightly apart from the others, spoke of a difference he himself might not consciously recognize. "He looks like you," Mason said softly. Sana's eyes never left her brother's retreating form as the students entered the dormitory. "Yes," she whispered, "father's walk, mother's eyes." There was both joy and pain in her voice, the bittersweet recognition of seeing the ghost of lost loved ones in the features of the living. They waited until the mission settled into night routines. Lamps extinguished one by one, the chapel bell tolling for final prayers, the guard taking up his position at the main gate. Then Sana rose, silent as a shadow. "2 hours," she said. "If not back, leave without me." Mason shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving without you." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Stubborn man. Then she was gone, moving across the open ground between the juniper grove and the mission wall like a spirit herself, barely disturbing the night air. Mason settled in to wait, rifle across his knees, eyes constantly scanning for any sign of danger. The minutes stretched, each one feeling like an hour as he imagined what might be happening within those whitewashed walls. Was Sana finding her way to the dormitory undetected? Was she even now waking Tarak, revealing herself to a brother who might not remember her face? What words could possibly bridge 5 years of separation, of different lives lived in different worlds? An hour passed, then another. Mason's concern grew with each passing minute. He was about to move closer to the mission when movement at a side gate caught his attention. Two figures emerged, moving quickly but cautiously toward the juniper grove. Sana in a taller form beside her. Tarak. Mason's relief was short-lived. Behind them, a lantern flared to life at the dormitory entrance. Shouts erupted, the guard at the main gate turning toward the commotion. They had been discovered. Without hesitation, Mason raised his rifle and fired into the air. The shot echoed across the valley, drawing all attention toward the ridge where he had positioned himself earlier in the day, away from the juniper grove, away from Sana and Tarak's escape route. It worked. The guard and several priests who had emerged from the main building all turned toward the ridge, several running in that direction. Meanwhile, Sana and Tarak reached the cover of the junipers, dropping low and moving quickly toward Mason's position. Go, Mason urged when they reached him. To the horses. I'll cover your retreat. Sana nodded, guiding her brother deeper into the shadows. Mason fired once more toward the ridge, then followed them, keeping his body between the mission and their escape route. By the time they reached the ravine where the horses waited, the alarm bells were ringing at the mission, lanterns bobbing as search parties formed. Tarak stood beside Sana's mare, his expression a complex mixture of fear, confusion, and something that might have been hope. Up close, Mason could see that the young man's eyes were indeed identical to his sister's. Deep, intelligent, wary. This is Mason, Sana said in English, gesturing to him. He help us. He... She hesitated, searching for the right words. He try save you before, when soldiers came. Recognition flickered in Tarek's eyes. The scout, he said, his English clearer, more practiced than Sana's. I remember. You gave me a horse, told me to ride north. His gaze moved between Mason and his sister. They told me all my family was dead. Not all, Sana said softly. I live. Search for you many years. Emotion crossed Tarek's face. Too many feelings to name, too complex to untangle in the urgency of their escape. The fathers will send riders after us, he warned. They consider me their ward. We'll deal with that when it comes, Mason said, mounting chance. For now, we need distance between us and the mission. Can you ride? Tarek nodded. They taught us, for farm work. He swung up behind Sana on her mare, his movements betraying familiarity with horsemanship that went beyond mission training, the muscle memory of Apache heritage asserting itself despite years of separation. They rode through the night, taking a different route than their approach, heading east toward the territorial boundary, where they might lose any pursuers in the labyrinth of canyons and mesas that marked the landscape. Dawn found them in a hidden valley, sheltered by towering red rock formations that reflected the morning sun like flame. Only then, in the relative safety of distance, did they pause to truly look at one another. Sana dismounted, approaching her brother with a hesitancy Mason had never seen in her before. Tarak remained on the horse, his expression guarded. You speak English well, Sana said, a simple observation to bridge the gulf between them. Father Thomas insisted, said it was the only way to... Tarak trailed off, perhaps realizing how the words would sound. To survive in the changing world, he finished more diplomatically. You remember Apache language? Sana asked, switching to their native tongue. Tarek's face softened slightly. Ha, Shadija, he replied. Yes, my sister. I remember some. More comes back now, hearing you speak. Mason busied himself with the horses, giving the siblings privacy for their reunion. But he couldn't help noticing the careful distance they maintained, the years of separation hanging between them like an invisible wall. Not all reconciliations were instantaneous, he knew. Some required time, patience, the slow rebuilding of trust. As he unsaddled Chance, Mason became aware of being watched. Turning, he found Tarak observing him with an intensity that reminded him forcefully of Sana. My sister says you tried to save me during the massacre, the young man said. That you were shot for your trouble. Mason nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude he felt he hadn't earned. Too little, too late. Should have done more sooner. Tarak studied him, his expression unreadable. Why did you do it? Turn against your own kind for an Apache child? It was the same question Sana had asked, yet hearing it from the boy himself gave it new weight. Because it was wrong, Mason said simply. What they were doing, what I was part of. In that moment, nothing mattered except trying to save at least one innocent life. The fathers at the mission taught us to turn the other cheek, Tarak said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. To forgive those who trespass against us, even those who murdered our families. Mason had no answer for that. The platitudes of Christian forgiveness rang hollow against the reality of slaughtered villages, of lives destroyed by greed and hatred masked as civilization. What is done cannot be undone, Sana said, approaching them. But we live, we remember. We honor those lost by continuing their ways. She looked at her brother intently. Is why I come for you, last of our blood. Should know who you are, where you come from. Tarak's expression grew troubled. And where do we go now? The Apache lands are gone, the people scattered or confined to reservations. There is no home to return to. It was the question that hung over all their plans, all their hopes. Where could they go, these survivors of a world being systematically erased? What future could they build from the ashes of their past? First, we deal with Wallace, Mason said, bringing their focus back to the immediate threat. He knows about the massacre, about his part in it. He won't stop hunting us, hunting you both, as long as you can testify against him. Wallace, Tarek's face darkened with recognition. The captain, the one who gave the order to fire. Yes, Mason confirmed. Now Sheriff Wallace of Copper Ridge, still hunting Apache, still killing, but now with a badge to justify his actions. Tarek absorbed this, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Whatever Christian forgiveness the Mission Fathers had preached, it evidently had its limits when confronted with the architect of his family's destruction. The mission will send word to the territorial authorities, he said after a moment. They'll say I was kidnapped. There will be searches. Which is why we need to move quickly, Mason agreed. Stay ahead of both Wallace and the law, at least until we can find a way to expose what he did. How? Tarek asked skeptically. His word against ours. A sheriff against two Apache and a disgraced scout. Evidence, Tsana said, at fort, where Wallace keep records. Orders for attack. Names of villages destroyed. She looked at Mason. You know this place? Mason considered. Fort Deliverance, probably. It was the base for operations in that region during the Apache campaigns. Wallace would have filed his reports there. If those records still exist. They exist, Tarek said with unexpected certainty. Father Thomas told me once that all military actions were documented, that someday, when the territory became a state, those records would be opened and the truth would be known. Hope stirred in Mason's chest, fragile but real. If they could access those records, prove that the attack on Sana and Tarek's village had been unprovoked, that civilians had been deliberately targeted contrary to official policy, it might not bring justice for all the atrocities committed, but it could at least stop Wallace from committing more. Fort Deliverance is a 2-day ride from here, he said, mentally mapping their route. We'll need supplies, a plan for getting inside. First, rest, Sana said firmly. Food, water, then plan. She glanced at the sky, gauging the sun's position. Safe here until nightfall. No one find us in this valley. They made camp in the shelter of an overhanging rock, each attending to tasks with the efficiency of people accustomed to survival in harsh conditions. Tarek, despite his years at the mission, fell easily into the rhythms of camp life, gathering firewood, helping to prepare the small amount of food they had brought with them. As they ate, Mason observed the siblings, noting the careful way they interacted. Sana occasionally slipping into Apache, Tarek responding hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as the language of his childhood returned to him. There was much they didn't say, couldn't say yet, about the years of separation, about the different paths they had walked. But they were speaking, and that was a beginning. When the meal was finished, Tarek moved a short distance away, sitting cross-legged on a flat rock overlooking the valley. His posture suggested meditation, or perhaps prayer. Not the formal kneeling taught at the mission, but something more innate, more connected to the earth beneath him and the sky above. He remembers more than he knows, Sana observed softly, watching her brother. Body remembers what mind forgets. Mason nodded. The mission couldn't erase everything. Not the things that were part of him before he had words to name them. Sana's expression grew thoughtful. Tonight I teach him blessing way, sacred ceremony, for protection, for healing memories. She glanced at Mason. You join also, if willing. Mason hesitated. Would that be appropriate? I'm not Apache. Spirits already accept you, Sana said simply. Show themselves to you, speak to you in dreams. She touched his arm lightly, the first time she had initiated such contact between them. You part of this journey now, part of what comes next. The gesture, small as it was, sent warmth spreading through Mason's chest. Then I would be honored, he said. As dusk approached, Sana made preparations for the ceremony, gathering specific plants that grew among the rocks, creating a small bundle of herbs tied with a strand of her own hair. She spoke quietly with Tarak, explaining what would happen, asking his permission. For this was his healing as much as hers, his reconnection with the ways of their people. When full darkness descended, Sana built a small fire in a hollow where its light would not be visible from a distance. Around it, she drew a circle in the sand using a mixture of corn pollen and crushed herbs. She motioned for Mason and Tarak to sit within this circle, positioning herself at what Mason guessed was the eastern point. Blessing Way is sacred healing ceremony, she explained, her voice taking on a formal cadence. Calls good spirits, asks for protection, for balance between all things. She looked at Tarak. Helps remember who we are, where we come from. She began to sing in Apache, a low, melodic chanting that seemed to resonate with the very rocks around them. As she sang, she sprinkled pinches of the herb mixture into the fire, creating sweet-smelling smoke that rose in spiraling tendrils toward the star-filled sky. Mason wasn't sure what he expected, perhaps nothing more than a comforting ritual, a moment of connection between long-separated siblings. But as the chanting continued, he became aware of a change in the air around them, a thickening, as though the darkness itself were gathering substance. And then he saw them, first as faint outlines against the night, then gradually more distinct. The spirits of the Apache dead, standing in a circle around them. Men, women, children, elders, dozens of them, their translucent forms wavering like heat mirages, yet undeniably present. Among them stood the spirit boy, Tarak's ghost, the fragment of himself left behind at the moment of trauma. But now Mason could see others who shared the same features. A tall, dignified man who could only be the sibling's father, a woman with Sana's eyes and Tarak's gentle mouth, other relatives whose resemblance marked them as family. Mason glanced at Tarak, wondering if he too could see these apparitions. The young man's face was transformed, tears streaming unchecked down his cheeks as he gazed at the spirits of his parents, his lost tribe. He spoke a single word, so softly Mason barely heard it. Shema, mother. Sana's chanting grew more intense, the words flowing faster, calling to the spirits, inviting them closer. The ghostly figures moved toward the circle, not entering it, but standing at its edge, their insubstantial hands reaching out in blessing toward the living. Mason felt a presence behind him and turned to find the spirit of a warrior standing there, an older man with battle scars visible, even in his translucent form. The ghost raised his hand in the gesture Mason had seen before, palm open toward him. Not a threat, but an acknowledgement, an acceptance. The ceremony continued, Sana's voice rising and falling, like the wind itself, Tarak occasionally joining in with remembered phrases, the spirits watching in solemn witness. Mason found himself swept up in the rhythm, in the sense of being part of something ancient and profound, a healing that transcended the boundaries between living and dead, between cultures and beliefs. When at last Sana fell silent, the fire burning down to embers, the spirits remained for a moment longer, a final blessing, a farewell, before fading back into the darkness from which they had emerged. All except the warrior who had stood behind Mason. This ghost lingered, its form growing more distinct rather than less, until Mason could see the details of the face. Proud, weathered, marked by a life of struggle and strength. The spirit spoke, its voice like dry leaves rustling in wind. Shiashi niguongo nahastian. Brother, the path is open. The same words Mason had heard in his dream. Then the ghost too was gone, leaving only the night air stirring gently where it had stood. Silence fell over the small camp, broken only by the soft crackling of the dying fire. Tarak's tears had dried, leaving tracks on his face that gleamed in the firelight, but his expression was transformed. A burden lifted, a connection restored. But then, in the dying firelight, a miraculous phenomenon occurred. Tarak's spirit appeared once more, the 11-year-old boy with ceremonial paint that they had seen many times before. But this time he did not appear alone. Beside him, a second form materialized, more ethereal, more abstract, a pure energy taking the vague shape of an ancient Apache warrior with different, more ancient ceremonial patterns. Bitsiwi ado nitse hakis an, Sana whispered in astonishment, her hand unconsciously gripping Mason's arm. When Tarak saw these two phenomena, his eyes widened in sudden understanding. I remember, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. When the attack began, I was so afraid. A part of me, my soul, seemed to separate from my body, but at the same time I felt the presence of someone protecting me. Mason observed, overwhelmed by the sight. So they are two different things? I thought it was Tarak's spirit. Sana nodded, her eyes never leaving the two spiritual manifestations before them. When an Apache child experiences great horror, the soul can split. Bitsiwi. One part to protect the mind, one part remaining with the body. At the same time, the ancestors send a Nitsehaki-san, a sacred guide to direct and protect. She looked at Mason with new admiration. Few white men can see both. You truly have a special gift, Mason Blackwell. The spirit of the boy Tarak moved closer to the real-grown Tarak. In a wondrous moment, it merged into his body, a soft light emanating from where they combined. Tarak swayed slightly, then stood taller, seeming stronger, as if a long-lost piece had been returned to its rightful place. I feel whole, he said, tears streaming down his cheeks. The memories I buried, the dreams I didn't understand. Now everything is clear. The sacred guide, now more visible in the form of an ancient warrior, smiled at all three of them. It raised its hand in a gesture of blessing, then looked directly at Mason. Shiazi ni yono nahasti, it repeated, the words Mason had heard in his dream and moments before. He now understood that it was not only a message for Tarak, but also for himself. Brother, the path is open, Sana translated softly, standing beside Mason. It has accepted you as part of our family, as one who belongs with us. The sacred guide nodded once more, then dissolved into the night air, its mission completed, bringing together those who were separated, healing broken souls, opening the way for the future. In that moment, Mason felt a profound change. The old wound on his shoulder, where the mark of his military unit lay, seemed to stop aching for the first time in many years. An invisible burden had been lifted from his soul. You saw them, he said to Mason, not a question, but a realization. The spirits, our ancestors. Mason nodded, not trusting his voice. The fathers at the mission said such beliefs were superstition, Tarak continued, a hint of wonder in his tone, that our ancestors were either in heaven with their Christian God or, he hesitated, elsewhere. They wrong, Sana said simply. Our people still here, still watch over us, guide us. She looked at her brother intently. Never leave you, even at mission, even when you forget them. Tarak absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. I didn't forget, he said finally. Not really, I just put it away, deep inside where it wouldn't hurt so much. Sana nodded in understanding. Now bring back out. Remember who you are. Nota. She smiled faintly. Eyes of eagle, like me. Something shifted in Tarak's posture, a straightening of the spine, a lifting of the chin that made him suddenly, strikingly reminiscent of his sister. Tarak Nota, he repeated, claiming the name, the identity that had been submerged beneath 5 years of mission life. Mason watched this transformation with a sense of privilege, of bearing witness to a moment of profound personal reclamation. Whatever happened next, whether they succeeded in exposing Wallace, in finding a place for themselves in a world determined to erase their kind, this moment would remain. A victory over those who had tried to sever the ties of blood, of heritage, of belonging. As they prepared to rest for a few hours before continuing their journey, Mason found himself reflecting on his own place in this unfolding story. He had begun as an enemy, become an unlikely ally, and now, what? Not Apache, certainly, yet no longer fully part of the white world that had sanctioned such atrocities. Something in between, perhaps. A bridge between worlds, just as Tarak was, though in a different way. The warrior spirit's words echoed in his thoughts. Brother, the path is open. Not a statement of kinship, he realized now, but a call to action. The path toward justice, toward healing, toward a future where such massacres would no longer be sanctioned in the name of progress. That path lay before them, dangerous and uncertain, yet open, waiting. Tomorrow they would ride for Fort Deliverance, seeking evidence that might bring Wallace to justice. They would face dangers from all sides. The law, the army, Wallace, and his men. Their chances of success were slim at best. Yet as Mason settled into his bedroll, Watching the siblings sitting side by side beneath the vast canopy of stars, he felt something he had not experienced in years. Hope. Not the fragile hope of personal redemption, but something larger, more profound. Hope for a world where Sana and Tarak might find a place to belong, where the ghosts of the massacred might finally rest in peace. It was perhaps a fool's hope, but as he drifted towards sleep, Mason decided he could live with being a fool if it meant following this path to wherever it led. Some journeys were worth taking, regardless of their end, and this one had only just begun. They reached Fort Deliverance shortly after noon of the second day, approaching cautiously from the east where a series of low hills provided cover. The fort was smaller than Mason remembered, a square stockade with a blockhouse at each corner, surrounded by a few outbuildings that served as quartermaster's stores and stables. From their vantage point on a ridge overlooking the fort, Mason studied the layout through his field glass. Security's lighter than during the campaigns, he observed. 2 sentries at the main gate, maybe 20 soldiers total based on the activity in the yard. The commander's office will be in the building on the north side. That's where the records would be kept. How we get inside? Sana asked, scanning the fort with eyes that needed no magnification to see the obstacles before them. Mason considered their options. Frontal approach is out of the question. They'd recognize you both immediately as Apache, and me they might remember as a scout who left under questionable circumstances. Tunnels, Tarek suggested unexpectedly. Both Mason and Sana turned to look at him. Every fort has them. Emergency escape routes in case of siege. The mission had them too. The older boy showed me once. Mason thought back to his time at the fort. There had been rumors of such tunnels, though he'd never seen them himself. If they exist, they'd likely exit some distance from the fort in a concealed location. Water, Sana said, pointing to a small creek that ran along the western edge of the fort. Tunnels follow water, easier to dig, hide entrance. It was worth investigating. They retreated from the ridge and made their way carefully around to the western approach, staying within the cover of the scattered pinon pines that dotted the landscape. The creek Sana had spotted was little more than a trickle this late in the year, its banks overgrown with willow and cottonwood. They searched methodically, moving upstream from where the creek passed nearest the fort. Sana took the lead, her keen eyes scanning for signs that would be invisible to most. Disturbed earth, unusual patterns in the vegetation, rocks arranged in ways nature would not place them. It was Tarek who found it, however, a small opening beneath an overhanging bank, partially concealed by a growth of willow. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to pass through on hands and knees, but it was unmistakably man-made, its edges too regular for natural formation. "This is it," he said with quiet certainty, like the ones at the mission. Mason examined the tunnel entrance, noting the age of the construction. Probably built during the early days of the fort, when Apache raids were common. Doesn't look like it's been used in years. But maintained, Sana observed, pointing to relatively fresh tool marks on the support timbers visible just inside the entrance. Someone keeps clear. It was a risk. The tunnel might be collapsed further in, might be guarded at its exit within the fort, might lead nowhere near the commander's office where the records were kept. But it was the only option that didn't involve a frontal assault on a military installation, however lightly guarded. "I'll go first," Mason said, checking that his pistol was secure in its holster. "Follow at a distance. If there's trouble." He left the sentence unfinished. They all knew what was at stake. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing Mason to crouch uncomfortably as he made his way forward by the light of a small lantern. The air was stale but breathable, suggesting some form of ventilation existed. Roots from the trees above pushed through the packed earth ceiling in places, and the occasional scurrying of small animals suggested they were not the only creatures to use this passage. They had traveled perhaps 100 yards when the tunnel began to slope upward, the packed earth giving way to stone steps that must have been cut by the fort's original builders. At the top of these steps, a wooden trapdoor blocked further progress. Mason extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. He listened intently for any sound from above that might indicate the trapdoor's location was occupied or guarded. Hearing nothing, he pushed cautiously against the wooden barrier. It moved slightly, then stopped, caught on something. A latch, perhaps, or simply the weight of objects stored atop it. Mason applied more pressure, feeling the resistance gradually give way until the trapdoor lifted enough for him to peer through the narrow opening. He found himself looking into what appeared to be a storeroom, shelves lined with canned goods, sacks of flour and beans, barrels of what might be water or whiskey. No guards were visible, and a thin shaft of light from a high window indicated it was still daylight outside. Pushing the trapdoor fully open, Mason hoisted himself up into the storeroom, then turned to help Sana and Tara climb through. They closed the trapdoor behind them, concealing it beneath an empty crate they found nearby. If they needed to retreat the same way, they could move the crate. If not, their entry point would remain hidden from casual inspection. Supply room, Mason whispered, orienting himself, which means the main building should be directly north of here. Sana moved to the door, pressing her ear against the weathered wood to listen for movement outside. After a moment, she shook her head. No one close, but voices further away. Many men. The mess hall would be on the east side, Mason recalled. If it's near mealtime, most of the soldiers will be there. Tarek glanced at the angle of sunlight from the window. Hour past noon, midday meal. It was their best opportunity. Mason eased the door open just enough to scan the yard outside. As expected, it was largely deserted, with only a few soldiers visible near the stables on the far side of the compound. The commander's office, their target, was a short sprint across open ground. Stay close, move fast, Mason instructed. If we're spotted, head back here and down the tunnel. Don't wait for me. Both siblings looked as though they might protest this last instruction, but they nodded their agreement. There was no time for arguments over who would sacrifice themselves if things went wrong. They slipped out of the storeroom, keeping to the shadows along the stockade wall as they made their way toward the commander's office. Twice they froze as soldiers passed nearby, but the men were engaged in conversation, not looking for intruders within their own walls. The office door was locked as expected, but Mason made short work of it with skills learned during his scouting days, when getting into places one wasn't supposed to be was sometimes part of the job. They entered quickly, closing the door behind them and barring it from the inside, a temporary measure that wouldn't stop determined pursuit but might buy precious minutes if they were discovered. The office was Spartan but orderly, a desk, filing cabinets, maps of the territory pinned to the walls with campaign routes marked in red. The current commander, Colonel James Hargrove, had been Mason's superior during his time with the 7th Cavalry. A strict disciplinarian but not a cruel man, from what Mason recalled. Whether he knew the full truth about the massacres his subordinates had conducted was an open question. The records will be in those cabinets, Mason said, pointing to a row of metal filing drawers along the back wall. Campaign reports, action summaries, casualty lists. Look for anything dated 5 years ago, anything mentioning Wallace or Apache villages. They worked quickly, methodically, each taking a section of the files. Mason found himself oddly moved by the bureaucratic precision with which atrocities had been recorded. Dates, locations, number of hostiles neutralized, supplies captured or destroyed. The bloodless language of military reports concealing the reality of families murdered, homes burned, lives destroyed. Here, Tarak said suddenly, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. He held a folder labeled Operation Cleansing Wind, After Action Reports. This is it, the attack on our village, our people. Mason took the folder, scanning its contents rapidly. The official report described a preemptive strike against hostile forces gathering for attack. A blatant lie, as the village had been peaceful, involved in no raids or resistance. But more damning was an appendix to the report, written in Wallace's hand, detailed instructions to his men to leave no survivors and make an example of the village for harboring suspected hostiles. This proves it was deliberate, Mason said, his voice hard with anger. Not a battle, not self-defense, murder. And Wallace gave the direct orders. Sana looked over his shoulder at the document, her expression unreadable as she stared at the papers that so clinically documented the destruction of her world. Take it, she said simply, proof for white man's justice. Mason carefully folded the papers, tucking them inside his shirt. They were turning to leave when a sound from outside made them freeze. Voices approaching, boots on the wooden walkway that ran along the front of the building. "Told you I saw something moving near the commander's office," one voice was saying. "Natives looked like, and a white man with them." "Probably just seeing things again, Jenkins," another voice replied skeptically. "Like that Apache war party you spotted last month that turned out to be a herd of deer." "I know what I saw," the first voice insisted, "and the door is barred from inside. Since when does the colonel bar himself in during daylight hours?" There was a pause, then a more authoritative voice. "Check it out. If someone's in there who shouldn't be, I want to know." A heavy knock rattled the door. "Colonel, you in there, sir?" Mason motioned for Sana and Tarak to move toward the window at the back of the office. It was small, but they might be able to squeeze through. If they could reach the stables, they might be able to commandeer horses for a faster escape than retreating through the tunnel. Before they could move, however, the door shuddered under a forceful blow, someone attempting to break it down. The flimsy bar wouldn't hold for long. "New plan," Mason said urgently. "When they come through, I'll create a distraction. You two make for the tunnel. Get these papers to someone who can act on them. A federal marshal, a newspaper editor, someone outside Wallace's influence." "No," Sana said firmly. "We stay together." The door splintered under another blow, the bar beginning to give way. "There's no time to argue," Mason insisted. "Those papers are the only chance we have of stopping Wallace, of getting justice for your people. They have to reach the right hands." A third blow and the door crashed inward, revealing 3 soldiers with rifles raised. Mason drew his pistol, not to fire but to focus their attention on him rather than the siblings. "Hold it right there," the lead soldier commanded. "Drop the weapon. Run." Mason shouted to Sana and Tarak, charging toward the soldiers to block their line of fire to the window. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Sana, instead of fleeing as instructed, moved with the fluid grace of a hunting cat, drawing the knife Mason had given her and disarming the nearest soldier with a sweeping kick that sent his rifle clattering to the floor. Tarak, despite his mission upbringing, was at her side in an instant, his movements echoing his sister's with an instinctive coordination that spoke of shared blood, shared heritage. The remaining soldiers, taken by surprise at this coordinated attack, hesitated just long enough for Mason to close the distance between them. He struck the lead soldier with the butt of his pistol, sending the man staggering backward into his companion. In the ensuing confusion, Sana retrieved the fallen rifle, covering their retreat as they backed toward the window. "Go," Mason ordered, knowing that any moment more soldiers would arrive, drawn by the commotion. "Out the window, toward the stables." This time Sana and Tarak complied, slipping through the narrow opening with an agility born of necessity. Mason followed, less gracefully, but with equal determination, dropping to the ground outside just as shouts of alarm began to spread across the fort. They ran, keeping low, using every bit of cover the sparse yard provided. The stables loomed ahead, their doors standing open, horses visible inside. Just a few more yards. A rifle shot cracked the air, the bullet kicking up dust at Mason's feet. More shots followed, forcing them to dive behind a water trough for momentary shelter. "We'll never make it to the horses," Tarak said, breathing hard. "Too much open ground." He was right. The alarm had been raised, and soldiers were emerging from buildings across the fort, weapons ready. They were surrounded, outnumbered, with no clear path of escape. Mason felt a terrible calm settle over him. They had the evidence they needed, proof of Wallace's crimes, of the deliberate massacre of innocents. But it would do no good if they died here, the papers lost or confiscated. He made a decision. "Sana," he said, pulling the folded documents from his shirt, "take these. You and Tarak make for the tunnel. I'll draw their fire, give you a chance to get clear." Before she could protest, a new voice cut through the chaos, authoritative, commanding. "Hold your fire! Stand down, all of you!" The sound of hoofbeats echoed outside. Mason looked through the window to see Sheriff Wallace leading a group of gunmen into the fort yard. "Colonel Hargrove," Wallace called out, "I'm here to arrest these fugitives under my authority." Hargrove stepped forward, standing straight, hand resting on his pistol grip. "These people are under military custody, Wallace." "Accusations from a traitor and 2 Apache natives hold no value," Wallace sneered. "Hand them over to me." Mason couldn't bear it anymore. He stepped forward to face the man who had ordered the massacre of an entire village. "We have evidence, Wallace," Mason said. "Your handwriting, your orders. Not for war or self-defense, but for money." Wallace's eyes flared with hatred. "Blackwell, I should have finished you 5 years ago." "But you didn't," Mason replied. "And now we have proof." Wallace stared at Mason, then suddenly smiled, the smile of a predator who had found another way to approach his prey. "I'll return with official arrest warrants," Wallace said, his voice too calm. "Don't let them leave here, Colonel." As Wallace departed, Sana shook her head. "He won't come back with papers. He'll come back with fire." Tarak nodded. "I know that look. The look of a man about to strike." "We must find our people," Sana said urgently. "Now, before Wallace finds them." They didn't know that one of the guards had been eavesdropping, a man Wallace had long paid to be his eyes and ears in the fort. The next morning, as they prepared to depart, Sana suddenly tensed. "Something's wrong." Just then, gunfire erupted outside the fort. Wallace had returned, not with papers, but with firepower. Mason risked a glance over the water trough to see Colonel Hargrove himself striding across the yard, his uniform immaculate despite the midday heat. But it wasn't the colonel's appearance that made Mason's breath catch. It was the group following behind him. Hannah Sullivan, the quiet shopkeeper from Copper Ridge, who had given Sana a sympathetic glance while others stared with hostility. Behind her came Dr. Samuel Hawkins, the town physician who had once treated Mason's shoulder, and several other townspeople Mason recognized. They were accompanied by a tall man wearing a federal marshal's badge that glinted in the sunlight. "What in God's name is the meaning of this?" Hargrove demanded, his stern gaze sweeping from the soldiers with raised rifles to the three fugitives crouched behind the water trough. The lead soldier saluted stiffly. "Intruders in your office, sir. Apache woman, a boy from the mission, and—" He hesitated, recognizing Mason. "And a former scout. Caught them stealing documents." "Not stealing," Mason said, slowly rising with his hands visible. "Recovering evidence of crimes that have been buried for 5 years." Sana and Tarak stood beside him, their faces calm, despite the rifles still pointed in their direction. The folded documents remained clutched in Sana's hand, visible to all. Hannah Sullivan stepped forward, her normally quiet demeanor replaced by a fierce determination. "Colonel Hargrove, we've come from Copper Ridge with Marshal Davis. Sheriff Wallace has been terrorizing our town, hunting these people with a personal vendetta that has nothing to do with law." The federal marshal nodded. "I have a warrant to examine all records pertaining to military actions against Apache settlements between 1878 and 1883. The Department of Interior has received troubling reports." Mason couldn't believe what he was hearing. "How did you find us?" he asked Hannah. "We didn't," she replied with a small smile. "We were coming to speak with the colonel about Wallace when we heard the commotion." Her expression softened as she looked at Sana. "Some of us have carried the burden of silence too long. When Wallace began ranting about Apache spies and army traitors, terrorizing anyone who questioned him, well, it was time to speak the truth." Colonel Hargrove's weathered face revealed nothing, but he gestured toward the documents in Sana's hand. "May I see those papers?" After a moment's hesitation and a nod from Mason, Sana approached and handed them over. Hargrove read quickly, his expression darkening with each page. "These orders were never approved," he said finally, looking up with eyes that had seen too much war. "Wallace was explicitly instructed to negotiate with that village. They were known to be peaceful, with no connection to the hostile bands." He handed the papers to the marshal. "I recommended Wallace for court-martial after that operation. The evidence disappeared before the hearing. And now we know why," the marshal said grimly, examining the documents. "These are in Wallace's handwriting, ordering his men to leave no survivors, to burn everything. This wasn't war. It was murder." Tarak stepped forward, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "I was there. I saw my family, my people, murdered while they slept or tried to flee. There was no battle, only slaughter." A heavy silence fell over the yard. Even the soldiers who had been pursuing them moments before lowered their weapons, the weight of the truth settling like a physical presence. The silence was broken by a commotion at the main gate. A sentry came running across the yard, his face flushed with exertion. "Colonel, riders approaching from the south, armed men, about 15 of them. Sheriff Wallace is leading them, demanding entry." Hargrove's decision was immediate. "Close the gates. No one enters without my direct order." He turned to Mason and the siblings. "You'll come with me. Marshal, I believe we have much to discuss before Wallace arrives. They followed Hargrove to his private quarters, a small but comfortable building separate from the main barracks. Inside, the colonel poured himself a measure of whiskey, offering the same to Mason and the marshal, while Hannah brought water for Sana and Tarak. I've had my suspicions about Wallace for years, Hargrove said, his voice heavy with regret. Too many reports of hostile encounters that left no survivors to question the official account. But suspicion isn't proof, and Wallace had powerful friends in the territorial government. That protection ends today, the marshal said firmly. These documents, plus sworn testimony from survivors, he nodded toward Sana and Tarak, will be enough to bring charges. Hannah cleared her throat softly. There's more. All eyes turned to her. Dr. Hawkins has been in secret communication with a missionary named Brother Joseph, who works in the high country north of here. He's been treating Apache people, survivors from various bands who escaped the massacres. Sana's breath caught audibly. Are people alive? Hannah nodded, including apparently an elder medicine woman who has been holding the scattered bands together. They call her Kiona, Sana whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. My grandmother's sister. Mason watched as hope transformed Sana's face, hope he had never seen there before. The possibility that she and Tarak were not the last of their band, that others had survived and preserved their ways, seemed almost too precious to believe. The sound of angry voices from the direction of the main gate interrupted their discussion. Wallace had arrived and was demanding entry, his threats audible even at this distance. He won't take this quietly, Mason warned. He knows what those documents mean. He'll burn this fort to the ground before he lets himself be arrested. Let him try, Hargrove said grimly. My men follow my orders, not his. But the next hours proved Mason's warning prophetic. Wallace and his men withdrew from the gate only to establish positions surrounding the fort. By nightfall, it was clear they were preparing for an assault under cover of darkness. A desperate gamble, but one that Wallace, facing the gallows for his crimes, might well attempt. We need to get you and these documents safely to Santa Fe, Hargrove told Mason and the siblings as they gathered in his office to assess the situation. Wallace can't be allowed to destroy this evidence or silence you. There's a back trail, Hannah suggested, through the hills. It's rough going, but it could get you past Wallace's men. We'll need a diversion, Mason said, studying the map Hargrove had spread on his desk. Something to draw their attention to the main gate while we slip out the back. The plan came together quickly. A nighttime sortie from the fort to make Wallace believe they were attempting to break his siege, while Mason, Sana, Tarak, and the marshal would escape through a rarely used postern gate on the fort's western wall. As they prepared to leave, Sana took Mason aside, her expression troubled. Wallace has bad medicine. Strong hatred makes strong spirit. She touched his chest lightly over his heart. Be careful, I feel danger for you. Before Mason could respond, shots rang out from the direction of the main gate. The diversion had begun. They moved quickly through the darkened fort toward the western wall, guided by a young soldier who knew the way. The postern gate opened with a protesting creak, revealing a narrow trail that wound up into the darkness of the hills beyond. They slipped out one by one, the marshal first, then Tarak, Sana, and finally Mason bringing up the rear. They had gone perhaps half a mile, the sounds of gunfire at the fort growing fainter behind them, when Mason sensed rather than heard movement in the brush beside the trail. He turned, reaching for his pistol, but too late. Wallace himself emerged from the shadows, rifle raised, his face twisted with hatred in the pale moonlight. I've been watching this gate for hours, he snarled. Knew you'd try to slip away like the cowards you are. The marshal drew his weapon, but Wallace was faster, firing a shot that sent the lawman diving for cover. In the confusion, Mason pushed Sana and Tarak behind him, drawing Wallace's attention. You, Wallace spat, the traitor who tried to save these savages. Should have killed you 5 years ago when I had the chance. It's over, Wallace, Mason said calmly. The documents are already on their way to Santa Fe. Hargrove knows everything. You can't bury the truth this time. Maybe not, Wallace conceded with a cold smile, but I can bury you. He raised his rifle again, aiming directly at Mason's chest. Mason lunged forward, hoping to disarm him, but Wallace's finger was already tightening on the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound echoing off the hillside. Mason felt the impact like a hammer blow, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. Through a haze of pain, he heard Sana's cry of anguish, the marshal's return fire, Wallace's shout of pain as a bullet found him. Then Sana was kneeling beside him, her hands pressing against the wound in his chest, her voice urgent as she called to him in Apache. Mason tried to respond, to tell her to keep running, to get the documents to safety, but the words wouldn't come. Darkness was closing in around the edges of his vision. The last thing he saw was Sana's face, beautiful and fierce in the moonlight, as she began to sing a low, melodious chant that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Mason drifted in darkness, feeling neither pain nor fear. Around him, he gradually became aware of presences, indistinct at first, then slowly taking form. The spirits of the Apache dead, watching him with solemn eyes. Among them stood the warrior who had appeared to him before, and beside him, the ghost boy, Tarak's spirit fragment, separated from him in the moment of trauma. Shiaji, Nigano Nahastin, the warrior said. Brother, the path is open. Mason tried to speak, to ask what path they meant, but found he had no voice in this place between worlds. A new figure appeared, moving through the gathered spirits. A woman in white buckskin adorned with intricate beadwork, her face painted with symbols Mason didn't recognize. Behind her, like a shadow-given substance, came Sana, her physical form somehow present in this spirit realm. Ezan Nadlehi, the spirits whispered as the woman in white approached. Changing woman. Sana knelt beside Mason's formless presence, her eyes seeing him despite his lack of physical form. I perform white-painted woman ceremonies, she explained, her voice echoing strangely in this place. To call your spirit back, to heal your body. The woman in white, or rather the spirit Sana was channeling, placed her hands where Mason's wound would be. As she sang, Mason felt warmth spreading through him, a tugging sensation as though he were being pulled back toward life. You must choose, Sana told him, her eyes holding his. Stay here with ancestors or return with me. Mason didn't hesitate. Despite the peace of this place, despite the welcoming presence of the spirits, he knew his path lay back with the living, with Sana, with Tarak, with the work still unfinished. As if understanding his decision, the warrior spirit nodded once, raising his hand in farewell. The ghost boy smiled, then seemed to dissolve, his essence flowing toward the mortal realm where his living counterpart waited. Sana reached out her hand. Come back now, she said softly. Follow me home. Mason took her hand, and the spirit world fell away. He woke to pain in the scent of sage, opening his eyes to find himself in an unfamiliar dwelling. A traditional Apache wickiup, sunlight filtering through the woven branches of its domed roof. His chest was wrapped in bandages that smelled of herbs, and every breath brought a stab of pain. But he was undeniably alive. Turning his head, he saw Sana sitting nearby, grinding something in a stone mortar. She looked exhausted, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting she had not slept in days. But when she saw him awake, her face transformed with joy. You return, she said simply, setting aside her work to come to him. She laid a cool hand on his forehead. 3 days you walk with spirits. I was afraid. Wallace? Mason managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. Dead, Sana replied. Marshall's bullet found him. She helped Mason take a sip of water from a clay cup. Marshall took documents to Santa Fe. Soldiers search for Wallace's men now. Mason tried to sit up, wincing at the pain that shot through his chest. Sana gently pressed him back down. Rest still needed, she admonished. Bullet missed heart but damaged lung. White-painted woman ceremony heals spirit, but body needs time. Looking around the wickiup, Mason realized they were no longer at the fort or anywhere near it. Where are we, he asked. Sana's smile deepened, reaching her eyes in a way he had never seen before. Home, she said, with our people. She helped him sit up enough to see through the wickiup's entrance. Outside, a small village spread across a hidden valley. Traditional Apache dwellings interspersed with more permanent structures. People moved about their daily tasks, some in traditional dress, others in a mixture of native and white clothing. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Kiona's band, Sana explained. Survivors from many villages. They live here in secret for years, taking in those who escape reservations or captivity. As if summoned by her name, an elderly woman appeared in the doorway. Straight back despite her years, her white hair braided with leather and beads, her face a map of wisdom and experience. Shiazi, she greeted Sana with obvious affection, before turning her penetrating gaze on Mason. So the white man who walks with spirits is finally awake. Sana introduced them formally. Grandmother Kiona, this is Mason Blackwell, who helped bring Tarak back to us and fought to expose the truth about our people's massacre. Mason, this is Kiona, keeper of our ways, leader of our band. Kiona studied Mason with eyes that seemed to see beyond his physical form. When Sana brought you here, more dead than alive, I thought her white-painted woman ceremony would fail. She nodded with grudging approval. You have a strong spirit for a white man. Thank you for taking us in, Mason said, sensing that Kiona was someone who valued directness, for helping heal me. You fought for truth, for justice for our people. Kiona's expression remained stern, but there was a hint of acceptance in her voice. Few white men would do this. She spoke briefly with Sana in Apache, then departed as silently as she had come. Sana helped Mason lie back down, his strength already waning. Rest now, she told him. Tarak will want to see you when he returns from hunting. Many people want to meet the white man who walks with spirits and return from death. Mason caught her hand before she could move away. The documents? Will they be enough to stop the killings? Sana's expression grew serious. Marshall says territorial governor very angry about what happened. Investigation beginning into all Apache battles of past years. Her hand tightened on his. It will not bring back those already lost, but maybe save those still living. It was a beginning, Mason thought as weariness overtook him once more. Not justice, nothing could truly be justice for what had been done, but perhaps the start of a different path forward. Spring came to the Hidden Valley, bringing new growth and healing. Mason's wound gradually mended, though he would always carry the scar and a slight catch in his breath when he exerted himself too much. He found himself welcomed into the community, cautiously at first, then with increasing warmth as he worked alongside them, learning their ways while sharing skills from his own background. Tarak thrived in the return to his people, the tension that had marked him at the mission gradually easing as he relearned the traditions of his childhood. He became Mason's shadow, eager to combine the education he had received at the mission with the knowledge of his Apache elders. And Sana, Mason watched her transformation with wonder. Among her people, she blossomed, her quiet strength recognized and respected by all. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, moving beyond gratitude or obligation into something neither had dared hope for in their broken worlds. Word came from Santa Fe that the territorial governor had ordered a full investigation into military actions against Native peoples over the past decade. Several officers faced court-martial for their roles in unauthorized attacks on peaceful villages. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was change. On a warm evening as summer approached, the community gathered for a celebration combining traditional Apache ceremonies with elements brought by other residents of the Hidden Valley. Former slaves who had made their way west after the war, Mexican families displaced by border conflicts, even a few white settlers who had found more kinship here than in the so-called civilization of the frontier towns. Under a sky ablaze with stars, with firelight painting shadows across the faces of this unlikely family, Kiona rose to address them. Her voice, strong despite her years, carried across the gathering. Many winters, our people hide here, afraid. Many winters, we keep separate, trust no one outside our band. Her eyes found Mason among the crowd. But times change, world changes. We must find new ways to survive, to keep our traditions while walking new paths. She gestured to where several new dwellings were being constructed at the edge of the village, a blending of Apache design with techniques Mason had suggested to better withstand the winter storms. Our community grows stronger by welcoming those who respect our ways, who bring their own wisdom to share. She looked around the circle, her gaze touching each face. Not all white men bring death. Not all change brings loss. We honor our ancestors by surviving, by adapting, by remembering who we are even as we become something new. After the ceremony, as the celebration continued around them, Mason and Sana walked to the edge of the village. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, until Sana spoke. Grandmother has given blessing, she said quietly, for us to build Wiki up together, if that is what you want. Mason turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I want whatever path keeps me beside you, he said simply, whether that's here or elsewhere. Your people, our people now, Sana corrected gently. You have been accepted, proven yourself not just ally, but family. Mason thought of the journey that had brought him here, from soldier to scout to rancher to fugitive, from complicity to resistance to healing. It was not a path he could have imagined. Yet standing here with Sana, under the vast sky of a land that had seen too much bloodshed, he felt a sense of rightness, of coming home. Then yes, he said, bringing her hand to his lips, let's build a home together. From the darkness beyond the firelight, a cool breeze touched their faces, carrying the scent of sage and the whispered blessing of ancestors watching over this new beginning. The wounds of the past would never fully heal, for Sana, for Mason, for the people who had lost so much. But here, in this hidden valley where old ways and new possibilities intertwined, they had found something rare and precious: hope. And for now, that was enough.